Hey guys, tonight we wander back through winding cobblestone alleys, the air damp with wood smoke and whispers, and the flicker of torches painting crooked shadows on stone walls. You're moving slowly, half curious, half uneasy, because in the medieval world nighttime wasn't just darkness, it was an open stage where superstition, rumor, and faith collided. And fair warning, you probably wouldn't survive this kind of stroll, especially without the right charms stuffed in your belt pouch. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the current time down in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little corner of the internet actually reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The alley narrows as you step forward. A loose chicken scuttles across the stones, its feathers ghostly in the torchlight. And for a second, you think of all the small, ordinary things that must have felt terrifying after sunset in the Middle Ages. There were no street lamps, no buzzing, neon signs, no phone in your pocket with a flashlight app. Just you, a tiny flame, and an imagination fed by sermons, folklore, and the gossip of neighbors. It's not just that the night was dark, it was thick, like ink poured over a village. When the sun sank, people genuinely believed a different world woke up, one filled with restless spirits, demons, and omens. Historians still argue whether medieval folks truly feared every shadow, or if we moderns exaggerate their terror. But the evidence in their songs, court records, and prayers makes it clear. Night carried a charge of dread. You hear footsteps behind you, nothing unusual, just another villager heading home. But you can't help thinking of one quirky tidbit. In some regions, people avoided traveling after sundown because they believed the devil disguised himself as a black dog and prowled crossroads. Imagine explaining that to your boss today. Sorry, I couldn't come to work. I didn't want to be eaten by the devil's Labrador. You pass under a crooked wooden arch, and the smell of roasting meat drifts out from an inn. Inside, the laughter is loud, maybe too loud, because rowdy voices keep fear at bay. When ale foamed in cups and dice clattered against wood, villagers could pretend the darkness outside was nothing more than an inconvenience. But deep down, they carried layers of protection, signs of the cross, whispered blessings, even a pinch of salt thrown over a shoulder. The cobblestones glisten, wet with a recent drizzle. Your boots slip a little, and suddenly you're aware of another superstition. Slick streets at night were sometimes thought to be the paths of spirits. People swore they saw figures in cloaks gliding along shining stones. Were they ghosts or just reflections of firelight? Hard to tell, but either way, you'd probably pick up your pace. Now, pause for a moment. Picture yourself as a peasant in the 12th century. You've worked 12 hours in the fields. You've eaten a chunk of rye bread, and you're trudging home. You don't know the scientific explanation for why the night feels colder than the day. You just know the chill bites sharper once the sun disappears. You tuck your cloak tighter and mutter a prayer, because, for you, protection doesn't come from logic, it comes from ritual. And here's the mainstream fact sliding in. Monasteries actually rang bells at specific hours of the night, not just to mark prayers, but also to remind townsfolk that order still existed in the chaos of the dark. Those chimes were a comfort, like a medieval version of your phone pinging to say, "Don't worry, I'm still here." The shadows stretch longer as you step into the town square. There's a well in the center, rope creaking as the wind teases. Wells had their own layer of superstition. People whispered that water sources could be entry points for spirits. Some even tossed bits of bread or coins into them as offerings. You lean over the edge, stare at your reflection, and suddenly, you're not sure if that ripple is yours or something else looking back. A cat darts past black, of course. Today you might smirk, but in the Middle Ages, that sight could ruin someone's week. Cats, especially black ones, were tangled up with witches, misfortune, and devilish company. Ironically, cats were also useful for killing rats, which carried the plague. So the superstition kind of backfired. Historians still argue whether the mass killing of cats worsened the spread of disease. But one thing's certain: paranoia often cost more lives than it saved. You skirt the edge of the square, and there's the church looming in the shadows, its bell tower like a sentinel. Churches were both anchors of safety and reminders of fear. You'd step inside for protection, maybe light a candle, maybe whisper a plea to a saint whose relic rested nearby. Yet at the same time, priests preached about demons lurking in every temptation. Comfort and dread in one package like buying. A cozy blanket that occasionally electrocutes you. The sound of hooves echoes suddenly. A rider passes, cloak flapping. For a second, your pulse jumps. Travelers at night weren't always welcome. Some were feared as messengers of ill luck. A story floats in your mind. In certain villages, if a stranger appeared on horseback after sunset, it meant someone would die before dawn. The rider gallops away, leaving you staring at the dust, heart thumping. One more step, one more corner, and now the alley seems to close in. You think about how fragile medieval houses wore: thatch roofs, timber walls, no insulation. Every creak or moan of the structure could spark theories of spirits or curses. Picture yourself lying in bed, hearing the wind whistle through gaps, and telling yourself, "Yep, that's probably a ghost. Good night." The wind picks up, carrying the smell of manure and smoke. You pull your cloak tighter again, but it doesn't help. That's the thing about medieval nights. They felt alive. Every sound had meaning. Every shadow could hide something. Every gust of air carried whispers. You weren't just in the dark, you were in a story. And let's throw in another quirky detail. Some people believed yawning too widely at night gave demons a chance to slip into your body. So, if you yawned while walking, you'd slap a hand over your mouth and mutter a prayer. Now imagine an entire village shuffling around, covering their mouths, my Dion, like some medieval flash mob. The alley finally opens into a meadow at the edge of town. Stars prick the sky, bright without modern pollution, and the Milky Way spills across like spilled flour. It's beautiful, breathtaking even, but also intimidating. Without telescopes, those stars weren't distant suns. They were omens, maps, divine messages. Historians still argue whether peasants truly tracked astrology with precision or just absorbed scraps from wandering scholars. But either way, the sky wasn't neutral. It was a message board, and you could read it wrong. You take a breath, the damp grass brushing your boots. Out here, away from the torches, it's darker still. Your own heartbeat sounds loud. Somewhere, a wolf howls. Maybe it's just hunting. Or maybe it's a sign that you shouldn't have taken this walk. And here's where the sarcasm sneaks in. If this were a video game, you'd be smashing the fast travel to morning button right now. Sadly, no such luck. In the medieval world, you were stuck with your fears until the rooster crowed, so you keep moving, guided by instinct and a tiny flame. The night stretches, heavy and endless. Somewhere in those shadows, superstitions are waiting, shaping how you live, how you pray, and how you dream. And whether you laugh at them or fear them, one truth settles in. In the medieval dusk, you never really walk alone. You clutch a candle in your hand, its wax dripping onto your fingers, and realize that this small flame is the only thing standing between you and absolute darkness. In the medieval world, candles weren't just sources of light, they were weapons against fear. Each flicker was like a whispered prayer. Each shadow, it chased away a tiny victory. You hold it higher, and for a moment, the gloom retreats, revealing the outlines of timbered houses, sagging fences, and distant fields that seem to dissolve into black nothingness. The flame sputters as a gust of night air blows past, and your pulse jumps. A candle going out in the middle of the night wasn't just annoying, it was a sign. People believed extinguished flames could signal a spirit's presence or divine displeasure. And unlike you, they didn't have a drawer of backup lighters or an Alexa turn on the lamp option. One blown-out candle might mean sitting in the dark with your heart pounding for hours, imagining claws at the window. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were more about church teachings or village gossip. But one thing's clear: fire was considered holy. Candles blessed at Candlemas, for instance, weren't ordinary wax sticks. They were shields. People saved them for storms, plagues, or moments when the devil himself seemed close. If thunder rattled the house, you lit one. If your cow gave birth, you lit one. Basically, if life threw medieval curveballs at you, candles were your first line of defense. You step forward, raising your candle to peer into a doorway. Inside, you see a family clustered around their own flame, murmuring prayers as though the candle were both light and guardian. It reminds you of how, even today, people light candles in churches or at shrines. The practice stretches back centuries, and though modern folks might frame it as atmospheric or symbolic, medieval villagers saw it as literal, spiritual. Armor, the candle drips again, and you wipe the wax from your hand. You think about how expensive candles actually were. Beeswax candles, the kind used in churches, cost a fortune compared to simple tallow ones that peasants relied on. The wealthy burned sweet-smelling wax. The poor got stuck with smoky, greasy animal fat that stank up their huts. And here's the quirky tidbit: some households rationed candles so strictly that children were scolded for reading or sewing after sundown, because every burned inch was like watching coins melt away. Imagine your mom today yelling at you, "Stop scrolling TikTok, you're wasting the candle budget." You pass another villager, this one holding a lantern. The glow glimmers through slats of wood, more practical for travel than your open flame. Lanterns carried their own loresome, believed certain patterns of light could confuse spirits or scare them away. There's even a half-forgotten superstition that placing a lantern in a window could guide lost souls to peace. But of course, it could also guide thieves to your house. Balance wasn't exactly a medieval specialty. You pause at a crossroads where a wooden cross has been nailed to a post. A candle flickers beneath it, melting slowly in the night breeze. It's not for light, it's for protection. Villagers often left candles at crossroads to ward off demons thought to linger there. Historians still argue whether crossroads became so feared because of Christianity's moral warnings or because pagan traditions already marked them as magical zones. Either way, you probably wouldn't linger here to long you'd light your candle, mutter a charm, and scurry home. Your hand trembles, and wax splashes onto your sleeve. The smell of smoke clings. You laugh nervously at yourself because it's just a candle, right? Yet deep down you know how much weight medieval folks gave to this fragile flame. They even read omens in it. If the flame sputtered, maybe a spirit was near. If it leaned sideways, maybe someone you loved was in danger. Honestly, medieval life was like one long, anxiety-inducing game of charades played with fire in the distance. You notice a line of tiny lights stretching across a ridge. For a second, you think they're stars, but know it's villagers with candles heading in a procession toward the church. Midnight vigils, funerals, feast days all carried the glow of hundreds of candles. The sight must have been breathtaking, like a sea of fireflies against the dark. But it wasn't just beautiful, it was a declaration. We own this night. Spirits, back off. And here's a fun detail. Candles weren't only about superstition, they shaped daily rhythms. Medieval timekeeping often relied on candle clock sticks, marked with notches that burned at roughly predictable rates. So, yes, your bedtime routine might literally be, I'll go to sleep when the candle hits line 3. Compared to your phone alarm, it's not super precise, but it worked. Unless, of course, a draft made the candle burn faster. Then you'd just lose an hour of your life without knowing. The candle in your hand is half gone now, stubby and uneven. You shield it with your palm as another gust brushes past. That's when you remember another quirky belief. If a candle flame suddenly burned blue, it meant a ghost was nearby. People swore they saw blue flames dancing over graves, which they called will-o'-the-wisps. Today, we explain it with marsh gases. But back then, the explanation was, yup, definitely a dead guy trying to mess with you. The flame dances, and you catch your reflection in a puddle. It makes you look tired, haunted almost. You wonder how people balanced this constant layer of dread. Maybe humor helped. Maybe it was like how we watch horror movies today, half terrified, half entertained. The difference is, you can grab popcorn and pause Netflix. They just had to sit in the dark and hope the candle held out. You cross a bridge now, the water below, black and endless. Candles were often floated in bowls or placed on riverbanks during certain feast days. They symbolized prayers carried into the unknown. But of course, there were darker takes too. People whispered that if your candle went out before reaching the far bank, it meant someone in your family would die soon. Talk about raising the stakes on a simple riverside stroll. The bridge creaks, and you grip the candle tighter. Its glow feels warmer now, almost alive, as though it's aware of your fear. Maybe that's why candles became so symbolic. They seemed to respond, to flicker in rhythm with your heartbeat, to lean as if they were whispering secrets. You'd never say it aloud, but holding one in the dark feels less like carrying wax and more like holding hands with hope. A dog barks in the distance, and the candle flame jumps. You mutter a curse and quickly correct yourself with a blessing, because words matter at night. People truly believed curses could ride the air like sparks, igniting bad luck. Lighting a candle while swearing was like pouring water on a campfire, pointless, and maybe even insulting to the flame. Finally, you reach the edge of the meadow again. Your candle is nearly gone, wax dripping onto your boots. You sigh, half relieved, half uneasy, because soon you'll be in darkness again. That's the paradox of medieval life. Every tiny flame was precious, but it was also fleeting. You never really conquered the dark, you just borrowed time from it. The wind softens, and your candle steadies. For a moment, it glows so bright. It seems impossible that such a small thing could hold back so much nothingness. You wonder if the villagers believed the flame carried part of their soul. After all, didn't they describe good people as shining lights? Maybe the candle wasn't just protection from spirits, it was a mirror of the fragile fire inside every living person. And as long as it burned, so did you. You glance upward, candle still trembling in your hand, and suddenly the quiet night is split by the beating of wings. An owl glides silently across the rooftops, its pale shape like a drifting shadow torn from the moon. You freeze in place, because in the medieval world, owls weren't cute bird-watching trophies or Harry Potter pets. They were omens, pure and simple, and not the good kind. If an owl perched near your house and hooted 3 times, you'd start worrying about who in your family was next in line for the grave. Historians still argue whether this fear of owls was purely Christian demonization of nocturnal animals, or if it borrowed heavily from older pagan lore. Either way, the consensus in villages was clear. Owls belonged to the night, and the night belonged to things that were not your friend. And here's the kicker. Sometimes people would actually kill owls and nail their bodies to barn doors, not out of cruelty for its own sake, but because they thought the bird's corpse worked as a sort of supernatural no trespassing sign against evil. Kind of like hanging garlic at the window, only smellier and with feathers attached. The owl circles above you, wings whispering, and your neck prickles. Owls weren't alone in this superstition category. Bats, crows, and ravens all carried their own heavy baggage. A bat flying into your house could mean a witch had targeted you, while crows were basically walking well, flying bad news bulletins. And ravens don't even get started. Their deep croaks and glossy black feathers tied them to battlefields, death, and war gods. You, trudging home with your candle, might hear one croak in the distance and immediately think, "Welp, guess somebody's not making it till morning." Of course, not all bird omens leaned negative. The quirky tidbit here is that some people believed swallows nesting under your eaves brought protection and luck. They were like the feathered opposite of owls. So a family might tolerate droppings and feathers everywhere just to keep that luck perched above their door. And yes, if you were wondering, bird poop counted as good fortune too. Try explaining that in a medieval tavern. Don't clean it. That's divine blessing on the rug. You keep walking, and above you the night chorus swells. A nightjar clicks from the woods, its strange sound almost mechanical. Villagers called it the goatsucker because they believed it crept into barns at night to steal milk directly from goats. Historians still debate whether this was a deliberate smear campaign against an unpopular bird or just humans making sense of random livestock deaths. Either way, it's another reminder that medieval science often went, if it looks weird, it's probably demonic. The owl swoops again, and you duck instinctively. Somewhere, a rooster crows prematurely, maybe confused by moonlight, maybe spooked. And here comes another superstition. Roosters were thought to be sacred alarms. Their crow at dawn drove away demons, marking the end of the dangerous night hours. But if one crowed in the dead of night, that was a cosmic scheduling error, a warning that something supernatural was afoot. Picture yourself lying in bed, hearing your rooster crow at 2 a.m., and immediately thinking, great, guess the Grim Reapers, making house calls early. You step carefully along the cobblestones, because every feathered presence seems like a message tonight. That's the thing, medieval people didn't separate nature from signs. Everything was a sign. A bird flying left to right across your path might mean safe travels, but the same bird going right to left, doom. It's like the universe was constantly dealing tarot cards in the sky, and you had no choice but to play along. Now here's a mainstream fact. Noble courts actually kept books of omens that included bird behavior, almost like an official manual for interpreting feathers. Some were surprisingly detailed, noting which wing flaps meant victory in war and which meant betrayal in politics. Imagine your boss today pulling out a manual and saying, "Sorry, can't sign that contract. A pigeon landed on the wrong side of the fountain this morning." Your candle flame catches the shape of a dead bird by the roadside, wings stiff, feathers matted. The sight makes you uneasy. Dead birds were particularly ominous, thought to be vessels where evil spirits had briefly lodged. Some people buried them with prayers. Others simply avoided the spot forever. It makes you wonder how much of the medieval landscape was shaped by avoidance fields no one plowed, roads no one walked, simply because of where an unlucky bird fell. A breeze shifts, carrying the scent of pine resin from the woods, and you glance toward the trees. Owls weren't just night watchers. They were also tied to witches. Folklore claimed witches could transform into owls, gliding silently to spy on neighbors or sneak into homes through chimneys, so that hoot in the distance might not be a bird at all, it might be your cranky neighbor, Gertrude, checking whether your cow is producing enough milk to hex. Historians still argue whether witches were genuinely believed to shapeshift or if this was symbolic language for suspicion. But in practice, villagers didn't care. If you heard an owl scratching at your window, you might throw salt on the sill or even hurl your shoe at it. Better safe than cursed. And yes, that's another quirky tidbit. Shoes were considered protective charms. So, if you ever lob a boot at an owl, you're technically engaging in medieval magical warfare. Congratulations, the night deepens, and you find yourself both amused and uneasy at the sheer weight people placed on wings and feathers. Birds weren't just background noise, they were part of the spiritual ecosystem. Every hoot and caw woven into a cosmic conversation you couldn't ignore. You imagine lying in your straw bed, trying to fall asleep while owls hooted outside, and each sound translating into a different category of worry. No wonder sleep was restless. The owl passes one final time, disappearing toward the forest. Its absence leaves the night quieter, but not calmer. Because now you're left with the echo of superstition. Might be a message, every wing a warning. You take a deep breath, steady your candle, and tell yourself it's just birds. Just ordinary birds. But in your gut, you know the medieval, you wouldn't have believed that. You'd clutch your amulet tighter, say another prayer, and quicken your pace. And here's the last joke for the road. Imagine trying to explain to a medieval villager that in your time, people pay money to sit in a dark cinema and watch a movie, literally called The Birds. They'd shake their heads and say, "You're insane. We already live that nightmare every single night." The sky looms vast above you, feathers now hidden in the dark. Yet you walk on, candle bobbing, knowing the night still has more stories to whisper. You come to a stop where two narrow dirt tracks split apart, one leading deeper into the woods, the other winding back toward the marsh. It's the sort of place that looks ordinary in daylight, but feels charged at night. In the medieval mind, crossroads were never just geography, they were gateways. You stand there, your candle flickering, and suddenly you're aware that this forked path could decide more than just your evening stroll. Crossroads carried heavy baggage. They were liminal spaces, thresholds where one world brushed against another. Historians still argue whether this reputation came from old pagan rituals, Christian warnings, or just the natural unease of having to make choices in the dark. But villagers agreed on one thing. If you lingered too long at a crossroads at night, you risked more than blisters. You risked running into something that didn't belong in this world. You shift uneasily because there were stories. At some crossroads, people swore the devil himself appeared to offer bargains. If you'd ever wanted wealth, love, or a quick solution to that cow who just wouldn't produce milk, this was where you'd supposedly meet him. The quirky detail is that medieval villagers didn't describe these meetings with red horns and pitchforks. Sometimes the devil showed up as a normal man in a cloak, sometimes as a dog, sometimes as a handsome stranger who just happened to know way too much about your personal problems. You picture yourself here centuries ago. You're exhausted, desperate, maybe grieving. The church has offered prayers, but they don't seem to work. The gossip says, if you walk to the crossroads at midnight and whisper your wish, someone will hear. Would you dare? And if a figure actually appeared, would you bolt or bargain? That tension alone was enough to keep people wary of forked paths at night. But crossroads weren't only about bargains, they were also about banishment. This is where criminals and suicides were sometimes buried, outside consecrated ground. The belief was that by placing them at a crossroads, their restless spirits would be confused, unable to find their way back to town. It sounds harsh, but it's also telling. People didn't just fear the dead. They strategized against them, using geography as a supernatural trap. You kick a pebble, and it rattles into the weeds. The sound echoes louder than it should, as though the night itself is listening. You remember another strange tidbit. Some villages placed protective markers crosses, iron nails, even jars of salt at crossroads. These weren't random decorations. They were like medieval antivirus software designed to keep spirits from loading into the world. Salt, especially, had symbolic weight, thought to purify and ward off evil. Imagine someone tripping over a random pile of salt in the road and thinking, "Yep, guess the spirits were busy last night." Your candle tilts as you glance down each path. To the left, the marsh glimmers faintly, and you recall tales of willow, the wisp's blue lights that lured travelers off solid ground. To the right, the forest sways in the breeze, its branches clawing at the moonlight. You can almost hear whispers telling you to pick one. That's the unsettling part. Crossroads made people feel watched, like unseen forces were invested in your choice. Mainstream history fact: crossroads also became sites for gallows in some regions. Executions here weren't just public warnings, they were symbolic. Hanging someone at a crossroads supposedly pinned their evil influence at the boundary of the community. It turned the whole intersection into a stage where morality, fear, and justice overlapped. And of course, the locals still had to walk past it afterward, glancing nervously at the dangling ropes. The wind rustles, and your candle flickers low. You imagine villagers hurrying past this place at night, clutching their charms, maybe muttering prayers under their breath. Some might even spit 3 times to ward off spirits, a superstition so widespread that spitting became a go-to ritual. Next time you sneeze and someone says, "Bless you," picture a medieval traveler hawking spit at a crossroads just to stay safe, charming in its own way. You take one hesitant step toward the left-hand path. The marsh air feels colder, heavy with damp. You pause, remembering a story. A girl in a nearby village once vanished at a crossroads, supposedly swept into the underworld by a shadowy rider. Her shoes were found days later, sitting neatly in the mud, as if she'd stepped out of them before being pulled away. Was it truth, embellishment, or pure cautionary tale? Historians still argue whether such stories were meant to warn young people away from wandering at night, or whether they recorded actual beliefs about gateways between worlds. A rustle to your right pulls you back. Maybe a fox, maybe something larger. The forest path seems safer for a moment, until you recall another belief. Witches were said to gather at crossroads for their Sabbaths. Villagers whispered of dancing shapes, strange music, and sudden gusts of wind that blew out every candle in the area. So, if you picked the forest path, you risked joining the wrong midnight party, one that ended with accusations, trials, right? Yet your skin prickles, because the medieval imagination didn't treat absurdity as a reason to dismiss fear. It treated absurdity as proof that something beyond reason was afoot. If the world already brimmed with miracles and plagues, why not witches at crossroads? Why not bargains sealed in the dark? The quirky detail here: musicians were sometimes accused of meeting the devil at crossroads to gain their talent. The most famous legend, centuries later, was about a fiddler or a guitarist who struck a deal for unmatched skill. But even in the Middle Ages, wandering minstrels were suspect. If someone played too well, people wondered where the gift came from. And what better place to trade your soul for a catchy tune than the nearest fork in the road? You draw your cloak tighter, the chill deepening. The crossroads seems to hum, silent yet alive. You think about how many lives pass through here: farmers, soldiers, lovers, sneaking to meet in secret. Each left their mark, and perhaps their fears. Every story layered onto the soil, until even a simple fork in the road carried centuries of superstition. The candle flame stretches tall, as if sensing your hesitation. You realize that no matter which path you choose, you'll carry the weight of these tales. That's the true power of superstition. It doesn't just sit in the background. It shapes every step, every decision, every heartbeat in the dark. You step forward at last, knowing you'll never look at a crossroads the same way again. And just to lighten the mood, here's the joke you mutter to yourself. If GPS had existed back then, half the entries would read, "Warning, crossroads. Ahead, possible demon encounter. Proceed with caution." You smile, but keep walking, candle trembling, because the night isn't done teaching its lessons. You shift away from the eerie crossroads, feet crunching softly on the damp earth, and your hand drifts instinctively toward the pocket of your cloak. The little object inside presses warmly against your palm, a crude amulet, nothing more than a scrap of iron shaped like a cross, but to Yuan, to every medieval villager, might as well be a shield, forged from heaven's own fire. You rub its rough edges and feel oddly reassured. This is the story of charms in your pocket, the everyday magic people clung to when night pressed too close. The medieval world was a minefield of uncertainty. Crops could fail without warning. A neighbor might accuse you of envy or sorcery. Sickness might sweep through your cottage overnight. Science, as we know it, wasn't a guide. So you did what anyone would do. You reached for something tangible that promised luck, safety, or even a little control. That something often took the form of talismans, charms, and little objects, carried in purses or strung around necks. Mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists have uncovered countless amulets in medieval graves crosses, rings etched with prayers, even coins folded carefully into cloth. These weren't random trinkets. They were tokens of protection for journeys beyond the grave, just as they had been in life. A knight might wear a saint's medallion into battle. A mother might tuck a carved charm under her child's pillow, and a farmer might bury a blessed coin in the corner of his field. Each action was a quiet declaration: the world is dangerous, but I am not defenseless. You tug the amulet free and hold it against the candlelight. The surface is worn smooth, like it has absorbed centuries of sweaty palms. This isn't the polished jewelry of nobles. This is a peasant's magic, rough and desperate. Some villagers carried iron nailses, actual bent nailses, protection, believing iron repelled spirits. Others tied herbs into tiny sachets and stuffed them into pockets. Rue Vervain and St. John's wort were the favorites, each leaf a shield against the invisible. If anyone asked why you smelled like a salad at midnight, you'd shrug and say, "Better that than possessed." The quirky tidbit here: people sometimes sewed frog bones into their clothing as charms. One bone in particular, the floating bone, was said to grant victory in arguments or help steal cows without getting caught. Imagine fumbling through your tunic and accidentally shaking out a tiny frog skeleton in front of friends. Talk about awkward luck. You slip the amulet back into your pocket, comforted by its weight. The night around you grows still, except for a distant owl's cry. You remember another kind of charm-written words. Parchments inked with Latin prayers were folded into little packets and worn on cords around the neck. These were called phylacteries, or holy slips. And even though few peasants could read, the letters themselves were thought to radiate power. Historians still argue whether people treated these as genuine theology or just another form of magic cloaked in church approval. But one thing is certain. Nobody tossed out a piece of paper covered in holy script. A breeze nudges your cloak, and you glance toward the forest. Somewhere in there, villagers believed, lurked creatures eager to snatch souls. That's why another popular charm was the hagstone, a rock with a natural hole through its center. Thread it on a cord and wear it around your neck, and it supposedly let you see through illusions or ward off witchcraft. Kids especially treasured them, peeking through the hole like a medieval VR headset and claiming they could glimpse fairies or spirits. You grin at the thought your pocket charm might be boring iron. But some child somewhere carried a magic rock and swore it showed them invisible worlds. The candlelight dances across your amulet again, and you think about how charms weren't limited to objects. Gestures, too, acted as invisible pocket charms. Crossing yourself before bed, knocking on wood, even spitting over your left shoulder each was a way of carrying protection in your body instead of your pocket. These habits were so ingrained that people performed them almost without thought, like checking your phone every 5 minutes today. They weren't rituals you planned. They were nervous tics of survival. But not everyone agreed on which charms worked. That's the fascinating part. Superstition was messy, localized, even contradictory. A talisman blessed in one village might be considered cursed in another. Historians still argue whether this patchwork of belief was shaped by lingering pagan traditions or by the church's attempts to control them. You imagine two peasants meeting on the road, comparing their pocket charms, and immediately accusing each other of witchcraft because, well, your frog bone looks shady. You shift the amulet again, feeling its edges bite into your skin. The sensation grounds you, reminds you you're not helpless. That's what medieval charms did. They gave people agency in a world where fate often felt cruel, and they weren't always private. Some villagers hung horseshoes above their doors, not tucked away, but proudly displayed, each nail hammered in with the hope of snagging luck before it slipped past. Horseshoes were iron, of course, and their crescent shape tied them to the moon's cycles. If one fell off, though, it was bad news. Picture a medieval homeowner panicking over a fallen horseshoe like you panic over a crashed Wi-Fi router. The road bends, and you stumble over a rut, nearly losing your candle. The flame wobbles, but survives. You mutter thanks not just to luck, but to the charm in your pocket, because somewhere in your bones you know that without it, the stumble might have ended worse. That's how deeply superstition seeped into life. Every mishap or escape was credited not to chance, but to the hidden weight of charms and amulets. The quirky detail deepens in some areas. Villagers tied wolf teeth into necklaces, believing they protected against fevers. Others carried dried weasel paws for fertility. And if you wanted your love life to bloom, you might tuck a tiny carved heart of lead or wood under your mattress. Forget swiping right tour. Medieval dating strategy was literally hope this bone bag works. You take a deep breath, the scent of iron mingling with wax. Maybe it's imagination, but the amulet feels warmer now, almost pulsing with its own heartbeat. You can see why people believed these objects lived. They weren't lifeless metal or stone. They were companions, allies in an endless battle against the invisible. Mainstream fact again, even kings carried charms. Charlemagne supposedly wore a pouch containing relics and magical words. Crusaders marched with crosses and blessed tokens stitched into their armor. The line between noble and peasant blurred when it came to superstition. Everyone reached for something small they could carry, because nobody was safe from the randomness of plague, war, or fate. The night presses closer, but your pocket feels heavier in a good way. You imagine sleeping villagers, each with a charm under their pillow, whispering prayers into the darkness. And then you think about modern eco's lucky coins, rabbit's feet, crystals tucked into purses. Maybe humanity hasn't changed that much. We still need something to hold when the dark feels too big. The candle dips lower, wax dripping onto your knuckles. You close your fist around the amulet and whisper a joke to yourself, just to cut the tension. If medieval villagers had cargo shorts, they'd have needed 30 pockets for all these charms. Forget style safety first. You smile, but you don't let go of the amulet, because even here, centuries later, in your imagination, the idea of charms in your pocket still makes sense. The night is vast, the world uncertain, and sometimes the only thing that steadies you is the tiny weight of something you believe in, pressed warm against your palm. You pass another cluster of cottages, their thatched roofs sagging under the damp night air, and your candle flame trembles as though it knows what waits ahead. You pause outside one low hut with smoke curling lazily from its chimney. The smell is sharp herbs drying, maybe sage or fennelland. For a moment you think about how ordinary this place looks. But then you remember what the villagers whisper. That's the witch next door. The idea of witches haunted medieval imagination. Every neighborhood seemed to have one. The old widow who muttered to herself, the midwife with too much knowledge. Of herbs, the reclusive shepherdess who preferred sheep to people. These figures became magnets for suspicion. You stand there, peering through the cracks in the shutters, wondering whether the person inside is healer, threat, or both. Mainstream historical fact: women, though occasionally men were accused of witchcraft throughout the Middle Ages, especially in the later period when church authorities grew obsessed with rooting out heresy. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum catalogued supposed signs of witches, from birthmarks to an unusual laugh. Yet historians still argue whether ordinary villagers genuinely believed every accusation, or whether witch was often a label slapped onto inconvenient neighbors. You edge closer to the hut. The air smells of rosemary, now pungent and almost comforting. Herbs were a witch's stock in trade, but they were also medicine. In an age without pharmacies, who else would you turn to when your child had a fever or your stomach twisted in knots? That's the paradox. The same woman who soothed your sickness with nettle tea might be accused of causing the illness in the first place. A quirky tidbit: some people believed witches stole milk by sending enchanted hares to suck cows dry. Farmers who found rabbits near their barns sometimes killed them on sight, convinced they were neighbors in disguise. Picture yourself sipping morning milk, then hearing that the hare you chased yesterday was actually Gertrude from 3 houses down on her nightly milk run. Breakfast just got awkward. The shutters creak open slightly, and you glimpse a figure moving inside. Your candle flickers, and you imagine the stories witches, boiling brews in iron cauldrons, muttering spells in half Latin, half gibberish. In truth, most witches were just skilled with plants, knowledge handed down from grandmothers. Chamomile for sleep, willow bark for pain, garlic for protection. But when remedies failed, suspicion grew. It was easier to blame the healer than admit the limits of human understanding. You shift uneasily, recalling how witchcraft wasn't always about sickness. If your cow miscarried, if hail ruined your crops, if your baby cried at night, the explanation was often the same. A witch had cursed you. This belief turned neighbors into potential enemies, communities into ticking bombs of paranoia. Historians still argue whether accusations rose more during times of famine and war, when people desperately sought scapegoats. The evidence suggests yes, hardship bred suspicion like damp breeds mold. The figure inside the hut bends over a table, grinding herbs. You imagine stepping closer, knocking at the door, asking for help with your aches. Would she welcome you? Would she mutter a prayer and hand you a charm? Or would she smile too knowingly, leaving you unsettled? That ambiguity is what terrified medieval villagers most, the inability to tell whether a neighbor's kindness was real or a mask. You remember another quirky belief. Witches could send nightmares by sitting on a sleeper's chest in the form of a cat or hag. That's where the word nightmare comes from, the mare being the spirit pressing down. Imagine waking in a smoky cottage, chest heavy, breath shallow, and thinking, great, Gertrude's cat is stealing my lungs again. The candle wax drips onto your hand, snapping you back. You look around and realize how fragile reputations were. One quarrel, one odd glance, one cow's misstep, and someone could be branded a witch. The church fueled these fears, but villagers carried them in their bones. To call someone a witch wasn't just gossip, it was potentially a death sentence. Trials by ordeal, hangings, or even burning could follow. And yet, despite the danger, people still sought out these same women when desperation outweighed fear. You move closer to the door. The night air hums. You imagine whispers. She helped heal a child last winter, but the boy died anyway. She sold charms, but one broke, and misfortune followed. Each tale twists tighter until the line between healer and witch blurs completely. Historians still argue whether most accused witches believed in their own powers or simply performed what villagers demanded. Some may have leaned into the role, half healer, half feared outsider. The hut's door creaks open. You freeze. The figure steps into the moonlight, a hunched woman with lines carved deep into her face. She glances at you, expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, your stomach knots. She could be anyone's grandmother, or she could be the witch of every fireside tale. She lifts a basket of herbs and turns away, vanishing into the shadows. No curse, no charm, no evil, just a tired woman tending her trade. You exhale, realizing how much of superstition was projection, fear filling the gaps of what people didn't understand. Yet the fear was real, and the consequences were deadly. You step back onto the road, clutching your candle tighter. The night seems heavier now, the silence pressing against your ears. You think about the countless women branded as witches. How superstition shaped not only fears but fates. It wasn't just a belief, it was a system of power, a way to control who belonged and who didn't. And here's your light-hearted joke to cut the tension. If witches really had all the powers people claimed, half the medieval world would have been turned into toads within a week. The fact that anyone survived at all suggests most of the accusations were, well, nonsense. but nonsense with sharp teeth. You walk on, leaving the hut behind, but the thought lingers. The witch next door might have been healer, midwife, scapegoat, or outcast, but to medieval villagers, she was always a possibility, a shadow lurking just beyond certainty. And that shadow follows you into the night, long after her chimney smoke has faded from view. You step farther along the muddy lane, the night thickening like damp wool against your skin. Your candle is a stub now, flame shivering in the breeze, and your hand instinctively tightens around a jangling ring of iron keys dangling from your belt. They clink softly with each step, an oddly comforting sound, as though every metal note is telling the shadows, not today. Beside them, a flask of holy water sloshes gently, the liquid catching the faint glow of firelight. These are your tools, your portable guardians, holy water and iron keys, in the medieval imagination. Evil wasn't some abstract theological debate. It was a real, lurking presence, waiting just beyond the flicker of torchlight. And so, people armed themselves, not only with swords or pitchforks, but with symbols, objects believed to carry the weight of divine or elemental power. Iron, in particular, had an almost mythic reputation. The cold, unyielding metal was thought to repel fairies, demons, and restless spirits. Hang an iron key above a cradle, and you could sleep easier, convinced the baby wouldn't be snatched by otherworldly hands. Mainstream historical fact. In many regions, iron objects were deliberately placed in burial sites, tucked under thresholds, or nailed into barn doors. Archaeologists have uncovered horseshoes nailed upside down to protect stables, and even iron knives hidden in roof beams as charms against witches. The logic was simple. Iron was forged in fire, the same fire that symbolized purification, and it bore a permanence that no spirit could unravel. Historians still argue whether this belief came from lingering pagan traditions about the sacredness of metalworking, or whether the Church later folded it into Christian symbolism. But the practice endured. Metal was more than matter. It was magic. The keys jingle again, their sound sharp and metallic in the still air. You grin faintly, imagining a medieval villager trying to sleep with every door locked, but still clutching a massive key ring under the pillow, just in case. The quirky tidbit here: some believed that rattling keys could literally scare away demons, the way clapping scares birds. That makes your nervous clinking feel less like an accident and more like an impromptu exorcism. Congratulations, you just invented medieval percussion therapy. And then there's the holy water, the flask cool against your hip. Churches blessed it, monks sprinkled it, and peasants carried it like a shield you could pour. If a child fell ill, you flicked a few drops over their cradle. If your cow staggered, you sprinkled the stable. If thunder cracked too close, you dashed some on your door. The idea was simple. Water, blessed by sacred words, carried the power to cleanse, protect, and push back the invisible. You stop at a cottage with a crooked doorway, and the faint, chalky marks above the lintel catch your eye letters, written during Epiphany, a priestly blessing meant to last through the year. Inside, the family probably keeps a jar of holy water on the shelf, ready to splash at the first sign of misfortune. You imagine a father jerking awake in the night, hearing the roof creak and muttering, "Don't worry, I'll water the demon away." It sounds ridiculous to us, but in that world, it was the best defense available. Historians still argue how much of holy water's popularity was driven by genuine belief versus the church's push to dominate folk practices. After all, villagers already had their own protective rituals, herbs, chants, iron. By blessing water, the church offered an officially sanctioned version of the same comfort, and villagers eagerly accepted, because whether the power came from saints or streams, what mattered was survival. You continue walking, the weight of your keys tugging at your belt, the flask sloshing like a secret heartbeat. Imagine the ritual: a priest standing by a river, murmuring Latin over the water, villagers crowding to fill their jars. Some dipped cloths into the stream, wringing them out to keep as portable blessings. Others rubbed the water on doorframes, treating their homes like fragile fortresses against invisible siege. It wasn't just about faith, it was about tangible sensory acts. You could feel the cool splash, hear the clink of iron, smell the tang of metal, and tell yourself you were safe. The quirky detail deepens. In some villages, people mixed holy water with beer or wine before drinking it, convinced it strengthened both body and soul. Yes, you're picturing it right. Medieval holy cocktails. One sip for hydration, one sip for heaven. And if you're wondering whether people got tipsy under the pretense of piety, well, historians still argue about that too. You pass a farmstead now, its gate creaking in the wind. A small iron horseshoe hangs nailed above it, gleaming faintly. Horseshoes were one of the most widespread iron charms, their curved shape thought to mimic the crescent moon and capture luck. Some villagers hung them upright to hold in good fortune. Others flipped them downward to pour blessings onto those who passed beneath. Either way, the sight of iron above the door steadied nerves. You imagine someone hammering it in place, each strike echoing like a challenge to the darkness. Try me. Inside your pocket, the keys jangle again as you walk. Their shapes are simple, crude by modern standards, but to medieval minds, they weren't just tools to open doors, they were symbolic guardians. Keys unlocked not just chests and cupboards, but, in some prayers, the very gates of heaven. To carry keys was to carry access, authority, and protection. That symbolism wasn't lost on ordinary villagers who clutched their rings of iron as if they could unlock safety itself. The road dips, and your candlelight splashes against a roadside shrine. A weathered wooden cross rises above a small basin, carved into stone, filled with murky water. You lean closer, realizing villagers must have refilled it after Mass. Imagine them stopping here on late-night journeys, dipping a finger, tracing the sign of the cross on their foreheads, and walking on reassured. The act was small, but it meant they weren't alone. You take a sip from your flask, the water cool and oddly calming on your tongue. Rationally, you know it's just water. But in the medieval mind, each drop was sanctified, each swallow a little wall built inside your body against fear. You almost chuckle, it's not so different from people today clutching lucky bottles or swearing by charged crystals. The form changes, but the need is the same. The night grows colder. You rattle your keys deliberately now, half for comfort, half for the thrill of imagining the invisible scattering. There's power in the noise, even if only in your head. That's the secret of superstition. It doesn't matter whether the protection is real. What matters is that you believe it is. And belief itself can chase shadows, or at least keep your heart steady until morning. One more quirky tidbit. Some villagers believed sprinkling holy water under the bed before sleep stopped nightmares. Others swore by laying iron scissors in the shape of a cross beneath pillows. So picture a peasant couple tucking in at night, one reaching for the water, the other slipping scissors under straw, both sighing with relief. Their sleep may not have been sound, but at least it was armed. You smile in the dark, the keys still clinking at your side, the flask cool against your hip. The night hasn't changed, still vast, still unsettling, but you've changed. You're carrying more than fear now. You're carrying symbols of defiance. And in the medieval world, that was everything. Your candle dips low, wax sputtering. You whisper a quiet joke, because sarcasm helps. Between the keys, the water, and the scissors, medieval villagers basically invented supernatural home security systems. Call it night watch. You chuckle softly, but you don't put the keys away, because whether or not the spirits truly circle in the dark, you know that with holy water at your side and iron in your pocket, you've joined centuries of travelers who faced the night armed with nothing more and nothing less than faith wrapped in metal and liquid. You finally stumble away from the farmstead, your keys and flask still jingling faintly, when a wave of weariness begins to settle over your shoulders. The road stretches endlessly, the shadows longer than your patience, and the candle in your hand seems weaker with every step. You blink hard, yawn, and then freeze. In the medieval world, sleep wasn't just sleep. Dreams weren't idle flickers of imagination, they were messages. You wake from restless sleep, except here you don't quite. You hover in that half-conscious state, blinking at the night and realizing you've wandered into the realm of dreams as prophecies. Medieval villagers treated dreams with a seriousness that would probably make your modern therapist blush. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were primarily imported from classical texts, like Artemidorus Onura Critica, or whether they sprang naturally from Christian sermons and folk wisdom. Either way, the mindset was clear. When your eyes closed, another set opened. What you saw there mattered. Imagine lying in a smoky cottage, straw rustling beneath your blanket, and suddenly you dream of a river flooding its banks. To us, it might mean you're stressed or you shouldn't have eaten that much cheese before bed. But to a medieval dreamer, water could symbolize divine warning, cleansing, or even the approach of plague. You'd wake sweating, muttering prayers, and perhaps hurry to the local priest. Monasteries often kept dream manuals, books that listed interpretations of common dream symbols. Dream of a snake. It might mean treachery. Dream of fire, passion, or punishment. Dream of flying. Possibly your soul attempting to reach heaven, or, if you'd been naughty, dabbling with the devil. These guides circulated widely, shaping how villagers, nobles, and even kings understood their nightly visions. Your steps grow heavier. You half expect to nod off right there on the path, curl under a hedge, and let the dreams come. After all, travel at night was dangerous anyway. Why not let your body collapse into prophecy? But you remember another quirky tidbit. Some people believed falling asleep at crossroads or near running water opened you up to possession. Spirits might slip into your dreaming mind, feeding you visions that weren't your own. Waking up with a nightmare wasn't just unpleasant, was evidence you'd been tampered with. You pass a lone traveler, slumped against a tree, clearly asleep. His face twitches as though trapped in some vivid dream. Do you shake him awake, or do you let him wander wherever his mind has dragged him? Villagers often feared waking a dreamer suddenly, thinking it might trap part of their soul in the other world. So you keep moving, watching his chest rise and fall, wondering what omens are playing across his closed eyelids. The night feels stranger now, the boundary between waking and dreaming blurred. You recall how medieval folks often prayed before sleep, not just for protection of the body, but for safety of the mind. The phrase, "guard us through the watches of the night," wasn't poetic. Fluff was practical. Without such protection, you risked dreams slipping into prophecy, or worse, into diabolical trickery. Historians still argue about the role of clergy in policing dreams. Some priests warned their congregations not to trust visions too readily. Others leaned into the idea, interpreting dreams to reinforce moral lessons. Dreamt of feasting. Clearly you're gluttonous. Dreamt of gold. Beware greed. The church had a knack for turning even your subconscious into a confessional booth. You rub your eyes, candle guttering low, and recall another quirky detail. Dream incubation. In some shrines, pilgrims slept near relics of saints, believing holy proximity would shape their dreams into visions of healing. Imagine snoring in a crypt beside the bones of Saint Cuthbert, hoping the saint whispers a cure for your aching joints. If you woke with anything other than back pain, you probably felt blessed. The candlelight wavers, and you stumble against a tree. Your eyelids droop. A dream starts to unfurl at the edges of your mind, even as you keep walking. In it, the moon drips silver liquid, your candle burns blue, and a crow croaks your name. You jolt awake, half awake, at least, and mutter. Historians still argue whether dreams came from God or goat cheese, but that one was not friendly. You laugh weakly, because humor is the only thing keeping you steady. Medieval villagers made jokes too, often mocking their own terrifying dreams. But even in laughter, they respected the possibility. A silly dream might still mean something. Better to pray and cover your bases than risk offending the divine by brushing it off. You picture a peasant couple in their cottage. One wakes from a nightmare of teeth falling out. He panics, convinced it's a sign of death in the family. His wife, annoyed, mutters, "Maybe it's just because you grind your teeth, Harold." Yet, by morning, they're both whispering about which cousin might be next to go. Superstition had a way of amplifying everything, turning private anxieties into public expectations. The quirky detail deepens in some regions. Villagers believed sharing a dream aloud could make it come true, or, conversely, prevent it from happening, depending on who heard it. So, dream etiquette was complicated. Tell the wrong person, and you might doom yourself. Tell the right person, and you might save a life. It's the medieval version of "don't jinx it." The forest path narrows, roots snaking across the ground. You blink again, and for a moment, the trees themselves seem to shift in your vision. Maybe you're dreaming while awake. Maybe you're just exhausted. Medieval people would have had no doubt. They'd say your soul was wandering, trying to slip free. Some even claimed dreamers could leave their bodies entirely, floating above fields or visiting distant towns. Historians still argue whether these out-of-body experiences were treated as spiritual gifts or dangerous dabbling. But in the candle's glow, you shiver at the thought that your body might not always keep hold of your soul. Your knees buckle briefly, and you lean on a tree, chuckling nervously. Great, I'm about to be the first medieval sleepwalker hit by a cart. The joke steadies you, though, and you force your eyes open wider. You can't afford to lose yourself to dreams now, not on this road. You think about how dreams wove into storytelling, how people shared them in taverns, sometimes turning them into cautionary tales. I dreamt the well ran dry, and the next week it did. Memory and coincidence blurred until dreams became woven into the fabric of daily life. And each telling made the dreams feel larger, more communal, as if the whole village had dreamed. Together, the candlelight grows faint, because dreams, for all their terror, also offered hope. To dream of a clear sky, of blooming trees, of gold coins, these were signs of prosperity, of fortune to come. Not every vision was doom. Some promised blessings. And in a world where survival was uncertain, even a fragment of hope carried enormous weight. You step forward, whispering to yourself the kind of prayer villagers might murmur before bed, that dreams bring guidance, not torment, that visions lean toward blessing, not curse. And as your candle burns low, you remind yourself of one truth that carried countless peasants through restless nights. Whatever the dream meant, the rooster would crow soon, and daylight would sweep the omens away. Still, you can't shake the feeling that tonight, in this dark stretch of road, you're already dreaming with your eyes wide open. The forest thins, and soon you smell something that makes your stomach twist. It's not the damp earth or the faint smoke of hearth fires. It's sharper, heavier, the pungent mix of burning pitch, incense, and the sour stench of sickness. You press your cloak to your mouth because you've wandered into a village touched by plague. And in the medieval world, plague was never just a medical crisis. It was punishment, curse, and cosmic reckoning, all rolled into one. You pass a house with its door marked crudely in red. Inside, you hear weak coughing, a child's cry, muffled by blankets. It was often moral. Sin bred disease, people whispered. A village that had grown greedy or lustful or lazy might suddenly find itself gasping for air, pustules rising on its skin. Mainstream historical fact. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing an estimated third of the population, explanations varied wildly. Some said it was God's wrath. Others blamed poisoned wells, foreign traders, or even cosmic misalignment of the planets. Historians still argue about how much medieval medicine understood contagion, but evidence shows people turned to both religious rituals and bizarre remedies in equal desperation. You edge closer to a fire pit where villagers toss herbs into the flames. Burning rosemary, juniper, or even vinegar-soaked rags was supposed to purify the atmosphere. You cough, eyes stinging, and think about how the villagers must have clung to the ritual not only for the smell, but for the reassurance. If they filled their lungs with sharp smoke, maybe they were filling them with safety. Nearby, a priest stands, sprinkling holy water, chanting Latin as if every syllable could build a barrier against death. You watch as villagers kneel, pressing amulets to their lips, whispering prayers. Some clutch candles, their flames guttering in the smoke, as though light itself could force sickness back. Yet the coughing doesn't stop. The smell doesn't fade. Faith battles plague. Sickness, if it survived, you were cured. You shake your head, half horrified, half amused, picturing peasants chasing squawking hens around in the middle of an epidemic, muttering, "Don't worry, it's medical science." You pass another hut where a body lies covered in rough cloth, already abandoned. Villagers often left their dead outside, too afraid to touch them. Instead, they'd sometimes ring bells or leave food nearby, as though appeasing both the spirit of the departed and the forces that had taken them. Historians still argue whether these rituals were driven more by fear of the corpse itself or fear of what it symbolized, divine judgment. Written in Pustules.U, step carefully around a cart piled with straw. On it rests another body, pale and stiff, the driver mutters, as he pulls the cart onward, bells jangling. These death carts became grim symbols of plague years, rolling through towns with regularity. The sight alone was enough to stoke superstition. If the bell rang near your house, perhaps you'd be next. Children whispered that to touch the cart was to guarantee death, and so they avoided the roads, holding charms tight, praying the rattle of wheels passed by quickly. Your candle flickers in the smoke, and you lift it higher. Where would you turn? Many turned inward, convinced their sins had called the plague. Others turned outward, looking for scapegoats. Superstition, when fear overwhelms reason, it often turns violent. The quirky detail deepens. Some believed loud noises drove away plague. People rang church bells furiously, fired cannons into the air, or even beat pots and pans in the streets. You grin grimly. Imagine a whole village banging cookware at midnight, not to celebrate, but to convince death itself to leave. Medieval noise pollution with apocalyptic stakes. You reach the market square, deserted now, except for a few abandoned stalls. Baskets of rotting apples sit untouched, their smell adding to the sour mix in the air. Food itself carried suspicion. Some thought plague spread through spoiled produce, others through poisoned wells. A lone dog noses the ground, ribs sharp under its fur. You wonder if villagers eyed it warily, convinced animals carried curses. Historians still argue how much of medieval plague response was rooted in medical theory versus sheer panic. Doctors wore long robes and bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, trying to filter the air. But for most peasants, such experts were distant. Instead, survival meant clutching charms, burning herbs, confessing sins, and hoping the invisible storm passed by. You pause near a well. Its bucket hangs unused, rope creaking. Rumors spread during outbreaks that wells were poisoned by outsiders or witches. Villagers sometimes filled them with stones to prevent anyone drinking. Water itself, once life-giving, became suspect. You lean over and glimpse the black surface, wondering how many desperate prayers had been whispered into its depths. A woman passes, carrying a bundle of herbs pressed to her face. You catch her eye, and she mutters something about Saint Roch, the patron saint of plague sufferers. In her hand is a crude image of him, scratched onto wood. Saintly relics became lifelines, carried from house to house like portable fortresses. Some villages even paraded entire reliquaries through the streets, hoping the bones of holy men could frighten disease into retreat. The smoke swirls thicker. You cough, tears stinging your eyes, and stumble away from the square. In the distance, you hear chanting, perhaps, a flagellant procession. These groups whipped themselves bloody, convinced that punishing their own flesh might appease divine wrath. Historians still argue whether such movements spread the disease further or merely spread despair. You find a quieter lane and lean against a wall, chest heaving. You look at your candle, almost burnt to nothing, and wonder how anyone found hope in nights like this. Maybe that's the point. When the world was falling apart, even a single flame, a sprig of rosemary, or a drop of holy water could feel like a fortress. Superstition wasn't just ignorance, it was survival, a way of telling yourself you weren't helpless against the invisible. The quirky tidbit lingers. Some villagers carried written charms, phrases scribbled onto scraps of parchment, promising protection. Abracadabra itself, a word we laugh at today, was used in magical triangles written to ward off plague. Imagine whispering it, not as a stage trick, but as a desperate plea against death. You take one last look at the smoke-filled village, at the shuttered doors and the faint cries within. The plague wasn't just sickness, it was a crucible that tested faith, community, and sanity. You clutch your amulet tighter, whispering a half-joking prayer. Please, if you must punish me, at least let me keep my candle lit. You chuckle weakly, because humor is the only shield you have left. And then you walk on, away from the smoke and the coughing, into a night that feels cleaner, but no less haunted. The plague may have spared you this time, but its shadow lingers, a reminder that in the medieval world, every cough was a prophecy, every fever a punishment, and every breath a bargain with fate. You walk faster, eager to leave the choking smoke of plague fires behind. The road dips into a hollow, and from somewhere up ahead comes a sound that doesn't belong to sickness or mourning its music. Faint, winding, oddly seductive, like someone plucking strings just out of sight. You pause, candle trembling, and smile despite yourself. In the medieval night, music could be comfort, but it could also be danger. Villagers whispered about certain tunes as if they were traps. You've stumbled into the realm of the devil's music. At first, the melody sounds harmless, a lute, maybe, or a pipe. You picture a circle of travelers at a tavern, cups raised, feet stomping in rhythm. Yet the longer you listen, the stranger it becomes. Notes bend in ways that tug at your gut, half pleasant, half wrong, as though the air itself is learning how to lie. That's the thing. In the Middle Ages, music wasn't neutral. It carried moral weight, mainstream historical fact. Church leaders often warned that specific intervals, especially the tritone, were the devil in music. The dissonant sound supposedly unsettled the soul, opening doors to temptation. Even centuries later, composers joked about the diabolus in musica, but in the medieval world, it wasn't a joke. Music had power, and power could lead you astray. Historians still argue whether this was rooted in theology or just discomfort. With sounds outside the neat structure of sacred chant, you creep closer to the source of the tune. It floats out of a clearing where villagers gather, illuminated by torchlight. They dance in rough circles, clapping, stomping, laughing. For a moment, you feel the warmth of the joy of bodies moving together, the rhythm of drums echoing like heartbeats. Yet you also sense the unease that lingers in the background. Too much joy, too much abandon, and suddenly the line between festival and frenzy blurs. Medieval minds feared that line. The quirky tidbit, some believed fiddlers or pipers who played too well must have bargained with the devil. Their talent couldn't possibly be natural. Rumors spread of musicians meeting dark figures at crossroads, offering their souls in exchange for fingers that never slipped. Imagine villagers whispering about the local lute player. He's suspiciously good at weddings. Definitely damned. You watch the dancers whirl, skirts flashing, boots thumping dust. The music grows wilder, less structured, as if inviting chaos. And you remember another belief. Excessive dancing wasn't just frowned upon, it was feared as possession. Entire communities sometimes broke into dancing plagues, convulsing for days, unable to stop until exhaustion claimed them. Historians still argue whether these were mass hysteria, ergot poisoning from spoiled grain, or genuine ecstatic episodes. But to villagers, it looked like the devil himself had struck up a tune. Your candle wobbles, nearly extinguished, and you picture yourself joining the dancers. The beat is infectious, tugging at your feet. But what if stepping into that circle meant more than sweaty fun? What if each stomp hammered you closer to hell's rhythm? That was the medieval worry, that music wasn't just sound but spell, shaping the body and soul whether you consented or not. One man stumbles out of the circle, gasping, face pale. He mutters a prayer, clutching his chest. Another laughs too loudly, as though trying to mask his own fear. You realize the line between joy and dread is razor thin here. They want to celebrate, but they also fear the celebration itself. Another quirky tidbit: tavern songs were sometimes banned during Lent. Yet villagers sang them anyway, convinced the melodies could chase away spirits or, depending on who you asked, summon them. Imagine being fined for humming your favorite tune on the wrong day. It makes your modern playlists feel downright rebellious. You glance at the musicians. Their faces are shadowed, but their fingers fly across strings and pipes. For a moment, you wonder, are they leading the dance, or is something leading them? That suspicion never left medieval people. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a possible doorway. Sacred chant lifted souls to heaven. Profane rhythms might drag them downward. Historians still argue about the church's true stance on folk music. Some records show priests joining in festivals, while others thundered against it from pulpits. The tension reveals itself in every note. Tonight the dancers crave release. The musicians crave applause. But somewhere in their hearts, each wonders if the devil is tapping his foot along. You take a step back, clutching your amulet. The music swells wilder until it almost drowns out your heartbeat. You think of the story of the Pied Piper, luring children away with his flute. Was he a man, a spirit, or a metaphor for disease? Nobody knew, but everyone remembered. Music could lead you places you didn't want to go. The quirky detail deepens. Some villagers swore that if you played music in certain caves or ruins, spirits would answer back, echoing with eerie precision. Was it acoustics? Probably. But to them, it was evidence that music bridged worlds. You shiver, imagining your lute notes answered by a ghostly choir. The dancers whirl faster, torches sputtering, laughter cracking into shrieks. It's joy, yes, but tinged with desperation, as if they're trying to outdance their own fear. You smile weakly and whisper a sarcastic joke to yourself. Medieval Spotify playlist top hit, Oops, All Demons remix. The thought steadies you enough to turn away. You retreat down the path, music fading behind you, replaced by the steadier rhythm of your own footsteps. Yet the sound lingers in your bones, echoing with both delight and dread. That's the legacy of the Devil's Music Kit. Wasn't about notes on a page, but about the unease of being moved, of losing control, of not knowing whether the rhythm carried you toward heaven or hell. Your candle burns lower, the wax dripping faster now. You clutch it close, promising yourself to walk straight, to keep your ears wary, and to remember that in the medieval night, even the sweetest melody might be a snare. You walk faster, eager to leave the choking smoke of plague fires behind. The road dips into a hollow, and from somewhere up ahead comes a sound that doesn't belong to sickness or mourning its music. Faint, winding, oddly seductive, like someone plucking strings just out of sight. You pause, candle trembling, and smile despite yourself. In the medieval night, music could be comfort, but it could also be danger. Villagers whispered about certain tunes as if they were traps. You've stumbled into the realm of the devil's music. At first, the melody sounds harmless, a lute, maybe, or a pipe. You picture a circle of travelers at a tavern, cups raised, feet stomping in rhythm. Yet the longer you listen, the stranger it becomes. Notes bend in ways that tug at your gut, half pleasant, half wrong, as though the air itself is learning how to lie. That's the thing. In the Middle Ages, music wasn't neutral. It carried moral weight, mainstream historical fact. Church leaders often warned that specific intervals, especially the tritone, were the devil in music. The dissonant sound supposedly unsettled the soul, opening doors to temptation. Even centuries later, composers joked about the diabolus in musica, but in the medieval world, it wasn't a joke. Music had power, and power could lead you astray. Historians still argue whether this was rooted in theology or just discomfort. With sounds outside the neat structure of sacred chant, you creep closer to the source of the tune. It floats out of a clearing where villagers gather, illuminated by torchlight. They dance in rough circles, clapping, stomping, laughing. For a moment, you feel the warmth of the joy of bodies moving together, the rhythm of drums echoing like heartbeats. Yet you also sense the unease that lingers in the background. Too much joy, too much abandon, and suddenly the line between festival and frenzy blurs. Medieval minds feared that line. The quirky tidbit, some believed fiddlers or pipers who played too well must have bargained with the devil. Their talent couldn't possibly be natural. Rumors spread of musicians meeting dark figures at crossroads, offering their souls in exchange for fingers that never slipped. Imagine villagers whispering about the local lute player. He's suspiciously good at weddings, definitely damned. You watch the dancers whirl, skirts flashing, boots thumping dust. The music grows wilder, less structured, as if inviting chaos. And you remember another belief. Excessive dancing wasn't just frowned upon, it was feared as possession. Entire communities sometimes broke into dancing plagues, convulsing for days, unable to stop until exhaustion claimed them. Historians still argue whether these were mass hysteria, ergot poisoning from spoiled grain, or genuine ecstatic episodes. But to villagers, it looked like the devil himself had struck up a tune. Your candle wobbles, nearly extinguished, and you picture yourself joining the dancers. The beat is infectious, tugging at your feet. But what if stepping into that circle meant more than sweaty fun? What if each stomp hammered you closer to hell's rhythm? That was the medieval worry, that music wasn't just sound, but spell, shaping the body and soul whether you consented or not. One man stumbles out of the circle, gasping, face pale. He mutters a prayer, clutching his chest. Another laughs too loudly, as though trying to mask his own fear. You realize the line between joy and dread is razor thin here. They want to celebrate, but they also fear the celebration itself. Another quirky tidbit: tavern songs were sometimes banned during Lent. Yet villagers sang them anyway, convinced the melodies could chase away spirits or, depending on who you asked, summon them. Imagine being fined for humming your favorite tune on the wrong day. It makes your modern playlists feel downright rebellious. You glance at the musicians. Their faces are shadowed, but their fingers fly across strings and pipes. For a moment, you wonder, are they leading the dance, or is something leading them? That suspicion never left medieval people. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a possible doorway. Sacred chant lifted souls to heaven. Profane rhythms might drag them downward. Historians still argue about the church's true stance on folk music. Some records show priests joining in festivals, while others thundered against it from pulpits. The tension reveals itself in every note. Tonight the dancers crave release. The musicians crave applause. But somewhere in their hearts, each wonders if the devil is tapping his foot along. You take a step back, clutching your amulet. The music swells wilder until it almost drowns out your heartbeat. You think of the story of the Pied Piper, luring children away with his flute. Was he a man, a spirit, or a metaphor for disease? Nobody knew, but everyone remembered. Music could lead you places you didn't want to go. The quirky detail deepens. Some villagers swore that if you played music in certain caves or ruins, spirits would answer back, echoing with eerie precision. Was it acoustics? Probably. But to them, it was evidence that music bridged worlds. You shiver, imagining your lute notes answered by a ghostly choir. The dancers whirl faster. Torches sputtering, laughter cracking into shrieks. It's joy, yes, but tinged with desperation, as if they're trying to outdance their own fear. You smile weakly and whisper a sarcastic joke to yourself. Medieval Spotify playlist top hit, Oops, All Demons remix. The thought steadies you enough to turn away. You retreat down the path, music fading behind you, replaced by the steadier rhythm of your own footsteps. Yet the sound lingers in your bones, echoing with both delight and dread. That's the legacy of the devil's music. It wasn't about notes on a page, but about the unease of being moved, of losing control, of not knowing whether the rhythm carried you toward heaven or hell. Your candle burns lower, the wax dripping faster now. You clutch it close, promising yourself to walk straight, to keep your ears wary, and to remember that in the medieval night, even the sweetest melody might be a snare. You leave the echoes of wild music behind, heart still thumping like a drum, and soon the air changes. It grows cooler, drier, almost reverent. Up ahead, A faint glow spills from a stone building where villagers cluster in hushed awe. You step closer, candle guttering in the breeze, and realize you've reached a shrine. Inside, beneath glass and gilt, rests a box small, jeweled, but heavy with meaning. You kneel instinctively, because here lie saintly bones and relics, treasures more powerful than any charm in your pocket. Relics were the medieval world's spiritual currency. A fragment of bone, a vial of blood, a shred of cloth if it belonged. To a saint, it wasn't just memorabilia, it was a force of protection. Villagers believed these remains radiated holiness, creating invisible walls against demons, disease, and despair. You peer closer at the reliquary, candlelight gleaming off its gold edges. Inside, a sliver of bone rests on velvet, delicate yet believed to hold the weight of eternity. Mainstream historical fact: relics were central to medieval Christianity. Cathedrals and monasteries competed fiercely to acquire them, sometimes going to extraordinary lengths or outright theft. The translation of relics, meaning their transport to new churches, was celebrated with festivals and processions. Relics drew pilgrims, and pilgrims brought money, so relics shaped both faith and economy. Historians still argue whether every relic was genuine or whether some were creative forgeries. After all, more than one church claimed to have John the Baptist's head, and Jesus' foreskin supposedly appeared in multiple places at once. But authenticity mattered less than belief. You shift on your knees, studying the villagers gathered around. Some press their foreheads to the reliquary, murmuring prayers. Others simply gaze, eyes wide, convinced therein the presence of heaven's fingerprints. You notice a mother holding a child forward, brushing the boy's hand against the glass. Maybe he's sick, maybe she's praying for protection. Either way, the relic absorbs their hope, silently promising to shield them from fate. A quirky tidbit: people believed even dust collected near relics carried power. Pilgrims sometimes scraped bits of mortar from saintly shrines, mixing the powder into water as a healing drink. Others sewed thread that had touched a reliquary into their clothes as invisible armor. Imagine explaining to your neighbor, "Yes, I'm wearing blessed lint today. Don't worry, it's fashionable and protective." You lean closer, the wax of your candle dripping on the stone floor. Behind the reliquary, a priest intones prayers, voice steady. The villagers respond in whispers, like a tide washing back and forth. The atmosphere is thick, almost suffocating, but also strangely calming. In a world of plagues, storms, and superstition, here was a tangible promise. The saints hadn't abandoned them. Their bones still worked, yet beneath the reverence, unease lingers. Relics could also divide communities. If a church lost its relic through theft, fire, or even accusation of falseness, it might lose its pilgrims and its prestige. Villagers might see disaster as proof that their holy shield had failed. Historians still argue whether faith in relics was pure devotion or pragmatic survival. But either way, bones became battlegrounds of belief. The priest lifts a small reliquary high, light catching its gold edges, and the villagers sigh as though breathing in protection. You imagine them walking home afterward, convinced their houses gleamed brighter, their fields safer, their children less fragile. That's the true power of relics, not just bones in boxes, but the psychological fortress they built. Fear shrank when saints stood close. Another quirky detail: not all relics stayed locked in glass. Some were portable. Knights carried tiny splinters of the true cross into battle, convinced victory depended on it. Peasants wore rings that supposedly held saintly dust. In fact, relics were so widespread that one medieval wit joked, "There are enough fragments of the true cross in Europe to build Noah's Ark twice." Whether true or not, the point remains. Everyone wanted a piece of holiness. Literally, you close your eyes for a moment, breathing in the incense-heavy air. The candle in your hand feels smaller here, overshadowed by the glow of the shrine. You realize how much relics must have meant to ordinary villagers. When plague raged or storms threatened, to touch bone or cloth tied to a saint was to touch certainty in an uncertain world. Historians still argue whether relic veneration blurred dangerously close to superstition, especially when people treated them like magical objects instead of symbols of faith. But to peasants, that distinction didn't matter. If a relic healed a wound, if it calmed a storm, if it kept a cow alive through winter, then it was holy enough. Theology could debate, survival couldn't. You open your eyes and glance around. A man dips a rag into a basin of water, blessed in the relic's presence. He wrings it out over his head, water dripping down his hair, as though washing his fears away. A woman kisses the reliquary, lips pressed long against the glass. These acts are intimate, desperate, but also communal. Everyone shares in the saint's protection, even if only for a night. The quirky tidbit deepens. Sometimes relics were paraded through fields to bless crops. Villagers carried bones like banners, convinced they could drive away locusts or summon rain, while farmers nodded approvingly. Yes, this will definitely help the harvest. In a way, relics turned saints into farmers, soldiers, healers, whatever their communities most needed. Your candle sputters, nearly gone, and you realize you don't want to leave the shrine. The darkness outside feels heavier by comparison, but you know you must continue. The road stretches on, and the saint's bones, though holy, won't walk beside you. Still, you rise steadier, as if some fragment of that radiance has clung to your cloak. You whisper a half-sarcastic joke as you step back into the night. If heaven has a lost and found, it's probably missing a dozen bones by now. You smile, but the humor is gentle, not mocking, because relics, for all their oddities, gave medieval people something priceless, the feeling they weren't alone. The night swallows you again, stars pricking above, shadows pressing close, yet your steps feel firmer. Maybe it's superstition, maybe faith, maybe both, but after kneeling before saintly bones, you carry the sense that even in the darkest hours, something unseen still watches, still protects. You step away from the reliquary's glow, and almost at once the night feels larger again, like the sky has swallowed the village whole. Above you, clouds drift apart, and the pale face of the moon stares down. Its glow spills over the path, silvery and cold, casting every tree and fence post into eerie relief. You slow your pace, because you know what medieval villagers whispered. The moon wasn't just a pretty light, it was a mischievous, sometimes dangerous power. Tonight, you've stepped beneath the sway of lunar mischief. The moon governed rhythms of planting, harvesting, and healing. Its cycles weren't mere backdrop, they were clocks, calendars, even warnings. Historians still argue whether peasants carefully tracked lunar phases with the precision some manuscripts suggest, or whether they just noticed when the full moon looked too bright to ignore. But in either case, the association was there. When the moon changed, so did the world. You look at its round, full glow, and your skin prickles. Full moons were thought to tug at the mind, stirring madness. The very word lunatic comes from luna, the moon. Medieval villagers believed it could twist tempers, spark violence, even summon creatures best left in fairy tales. You picture a shepherd returning late under a full moon, sheep bleating nervously, and the neighbors whispering, "Don't trust his smile tomorrow. He's been touched by the moonlight." Mainstream historical fact: physicians sometimes scheduled treatments based on lunar phases. Bloodletting, for instance, might be timed to coincide with a waning moon, thought to draw illness out more effectively. Surgeons, limited as they were, kept lunar calendars, like sailors kept tide charts. The sky wasn't decoration, it was a medical chart hung above every roof. Your candle flickers in the moon's glare, suddenly looking fragile, almost redundant. You wonder if villagers ever blew out their flames on full moon nights, convinced that silver light was protection enough. Then you remember another superstition. Moonlight wasn't always safe. Some believed that if you slept under its rays, your health might wither. It could bleach the spirit, thin the blood, or leave you moonstruck. Imagine dozing outside after a feast, only to wake blamed for your own dizziness because you let the moon stare too long at your face. A quirky tidbit: people swore that dew collected on certain nights of the full moon had magical properties. Women might wash their faces with it to preserve beauty, while others sprinkled it on fields for fertility. You grin, picturing a medieval farmer muttering, "No rain for weeks, but at least the moon gave me beauty water." The path curves by a pond, and the moon's reflection wavers in the ripples. You pause, uneasy. Water and moonlight together created double mischief. Folklore warned that spirits danced on water during full moons, luring careless villagers to drown. Parents told children never to stare too long at reflections in ponds, lest the moon drag their souls downward. Historians still argue whether such tales were simple safety warnings in disguise. Don't wander near ponds at night, kids, or genuine belief in supernatural abductions. You kneel by the bank, candle trembling, and for a moment the reflected moon seems to wink. You snort softly, shaking your head, but deep down you understand why villagers took no chances. Life was fragile enough without angering the sky. Further along the path, you pass a small group of villagers gathered in a field. They glance upward, muttering prayers and charms. Some carry bundles of herbs to harvest by moonlight, believing plants plucked beneath its glow carried stronger power. In particular, St. John's wort and vervain were prized on midsummer nights when the moon was high. These weren't random chores, they were rituals. Every snip of herb a way to catch lunar blessing. The quirky detail deepens. Some believed moonlight could charge objects. Leave your scissors out under a waxing moon, and they'd cut better. Lay your sword in the silver glow, and it might strike truer. The moon was medieval wireless charging. If you like, though, instead of smartphones, it juiced up your kitchenware. You keep walking, moonlight silvering the road ahead. You think of the darker tales, werewolves, of course. though the legends evolved over centuries. Even in the Middle Ages, villagers whispered of men cursed to change shape under the full moon, their bodies twisted by its pull. Sometimes they were punished sinners, sometimes unlucky victims of enchantment. Historians still argue whether these tales were taken literally or served as metaphors for human rage and violence. But the fear was real enough that travelers avoided forests during certain nights, convinced they'd hear snarls in the underbrush. You chuckle nervously and whisper, "Note to self, don't pet stray dogs tonight." Humor lightens the weight, but you can't shake the feeling of being observed. The moon stares too steadily, too coldly, and every rustle in the grass sounds like claws. The candle is nearly gone, wax pooling against your fingers, but the moon is so bright you hardly need it. Shadows stretch sharp across the path, every twig outlined in silver. You imagine villagers looking out their windows, unable to sleep under this glow, whispering that the moon was keeping count of their sins. Some even claim to see faces in its surface, watching. Was it the Virgin? A sinner trapped for eternity? Historians still argue which interpretations dominated, but everyone agreed the moon was alive in some way. You pause at a crossroads shrine, this one marked with a crude wooden image of the Virgin Mary. A bowl of water sits beneath it, gleaming under the moon. You lean closer and realize villagers have placed coins at the bottom, offerings shimmering in silver light. Perhaps they hoped Mary herself would catch the moon's mischief and turn it into blessing. You whisper another joke, softer this time. Imagine being the moon and hearing centuries of people blame you for bad crops, madness, and monsters. Must be exhausting. You smile, but it fades quickly, because you understand why people believed. When your world is unpredictable, anything constant like the moon feels powerful, maybe even personal. The path rises onto a ridge. From here, you can see fields stretching pale under the silver glow, every furrow sharp, every hut shadowed. The silence is immense. You think about how villagers lived their entire lives under this gaze, measuring time by it, fearing its pull, praying for its mercy. And as the wind brushes your face, you realize something. Superstition wasn't just about fear, it was about connection. The moon wasn't distant, it was woven into daily life, into medicine, farming, love, and lore. To medieval villagers, ignoring it wasn't an option. You respected it, feared it, maybe even loved it, but you never forgot it was watching. Your candle dies at last, leaving only the moonlight to guide you. You don't panic, not now, because even with all its mischief, the moon has lit the road for centuries. You keep walking, silver shadows at your heels, knowing that tonight, like countless villagers before you, you travel not by torch or lamp, but by the ancient, mischievous eye in the sky. The silver moon follows you as you leave the ridge behind, and the path dips toward a cluster of dark stone ruins. The air shifts here, it's cooler, heavier, and carries the faint smell of moss and something older, like dust that hasn't been disturbed in centuries. You clutch your cloak tighter, because the villagers warned you about this place. These aren't just broken walls and crumbling towers. These are cursed castles, and in the medieval imagination, stone itself could remember. You step through a collapsed archway, candle stub reignited with effort, and the flame sputters against the damp air. The ruins loom like broken teeth against the sky. Ivy snakes along jagged walls, and a hollow window gapes at you like a blind eye. It's easy to see why castles became magnets for ghost stories. They were grand, isolated, and often drenched. In violent history, every crack in the mortar whispered of betrayal, battle, or bloodshed. And where there was blood, there were restless spirits. Mainstream historical fact. Many medieval chronicles included tales of haunted castles. Chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis described ghosts wandering battlefields and fortresses, sometimes appearing as warnings, sometimes demanding justice. Castles weren't just military strongholds, they were stages for legend. Historians still argue whether these stories were literal beliefs or moral allegories meant to remind listeners of sin and consequence. Either way, a crumbling tower at midnight was rarely just old real estate. You tread carefully across the courtyard. The stones beneath your boots are slick with moss, but what chills you more is the silence. No crickets, no birds, just the drip of water from broken gutters. Villagers swore that silence like this meant spirits were awake, their murmurs just beyond human hearing. You raise your candle higher, half expecting to see a face in the window above. A quirky tidbit: in some castles, people nailed animal skulls into the walls as protection. Horses, oxen, even cats were sacrificed, sealed into the masonry to keep evil spirits at bay. Archaeologists have found them centuries later, grinning from inside the stone. Imagine eating supper in the Great Hall, never knowing a goat skull was staring at you through the plaster. You step into what remains of the Great Hall. The roof has collapsed, but a portion of the wall still rises, decorated faintly with soot-blackened murals. You squint, candlelight flickering across faded saints and beasts. Villagers might have gathered here once, feasting and laughing, but the whispers say otherwise now. They say armored figures walk these stones at night, replaying battles they never survived. They say women in white glide through the corridors, wailing for lost children. They say you'd be a fool to linger, and yet you do. You pause in the center, letting your candlelight tremble across the floor. The shadows twitch like figures gathering, and you remind yourself to breathe. Humor slips in because you need it. Note to self: next Airbnb, check the ghost policy before booking. But the fear is real. Even in modern ruins, you felt it's that prickle at the back of your neck, the sense that the stones themselves are watching. For medieval villagers, that wasn't imagination. It was memory. Stone absorbed events, and castles had seen plenty. Historians still argue about the role of architecture in superstition. Did castles become haunted simply because they were dramatic settings, or because their walls really did preserve echoes? Acoustics, drafts, creaking timbers all could explain mysterious sounds, but to a peasant stumbling near one on a full moon night, no explanation was needed. That groan was a ghost. That draft was a night's last breath. You wander through a narrow stairwell, boots scraping stone. At the top, a chamber opens, with one window still intact. Through it, the moonlight spills, pale and perfect. You lift your candle, and in its glow you spot carving scratches etched into the stone. Not art, not graffiti, but protection. Crosses, circles, runes. Villagers or guards once carved them to ward off spirits. You trace a cross with your finger, imagining a trembling hand doing the same centuries ago. Another quirky detail: some Castles were thought cursed from the moment they were built. If masons cut corners or lords seized land unjustly, the walls themselves were doomed. People whispered that no roof would ever hold, no feast would last, until justice was done. These stories gave crumbling ruins a moral weight. The stones fell, because the sins were heavier than the mortar. Your candle drips wax onto the sill, and you glance outside. The fields stretch wide and empty, but in your imagination you see armies. You hear trumpets, clash of steel, screams echoing off these walls. That's the thing about cursed castles. They were perfect vessels for memory. Even if the ghosts weren't real, the weight of history was. You think of noble families who slept here, plotting wars, arranging marriages, poisoning rivals. How many secrets still linger in the mortar? How many souls paced these halls unwilling to leave? You whisper softly, almost respectfully, "I'm just passing through. Don't mind me." Because if superstition teaches anything, it's that politeness never hurts. The candle burns low. You decide not to test fate further. The hall seems colder, the silence heavier, and the moon's eye through the window less friendly. You step back, boots crunching stone, and make your way toward the ruined gate. As you leave, you glance once more at the looming tower. You can almost imagine a figure watching, armored and still, its eyes glowing faint in the moonlight. You shake your head, muttering a sarcastic quip. Great, medieval haunted castles, the original horror franchises. They never even needed sequels. But as you walk into the night, you don't laugh long. The image clings, the tower etched in your memory, the sense that even empty walls can whisper. That's what cursed castles do. They follow you home, long after the stones are out of sight. The ruins shrank behind you until they're just jagged shadows against the moon. You walk faster, boots slipping in damp earth, because even sarcasm can't hide the way your skin prickled back there. But soon, another smell cuts through the night, sharp, earthy, a little bitter. The road winds past a cluster of huts, their windows faintly lit, and you hear soft clinking of pots, gentle bubbling, and the scrape of wooden spoons. You realize you've reached the heart of something far less grand than castles, but perhaps even more essential to medieval life: magical healing brews. Step inside one of these huts, and you see a woman bent over a cauldron, or a man hunched with pestle and mortar. Shelves sag under bundles of dried herbs: thyme, rosemary, fennel, sage. To you, it smells like soup. Every illness, ache, or fever sent people scrambling for these concoctions, which blurred the line between medicine and magic, mainstream historical fact, medical practice in the Middle Ages, mixed scholarly knowledge from texts like Galen's with folk remedies. Physicians in universities prescribed treatments based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Their healers were local wise women or men who relied on herbs, prayers, and superstition in equal measure. Historians still argue how effective these remedies were, but archaeological evidence of plant use suggests some did work at least better than nothing. You peek through a doorway. A woman stirs a steaming pot, her face lit gold by the fire. She sprinkles powdered root, mutters a phrase, half Latin, half local dialect. Was it science? Was it spell? In this world, nobody cared to separate them. Healing demanded both. You don't just drink a brew. you drink the hope woven into it. A quirky tidbit. Recipes often included bizarre ingredients, powdered gemstones, ground up mummy from Egypt, or even dried toads. The logic was rarely biological. It was symbolic. Rubies for vitality, mummy for strength, toads for drawing out poison. Imagine running to your healer with a toothache and being handed a drink flavored with frog dust. Don't worry, they'd say, it's good for you. You'd choke it down anyway, because what if it worked? You lean against the doorway, candle trembling, and watch the healer pour the brew into a clay cup. The patient, inside a young man pale with fever sips, grimacing at the bitterness. His mother clasps his hands, eyes closed in prayer. That's the essence of medieval healing: bitterness, prayer, and patience. And if he recovered, the healer was praised. If not, well, maybe a witch's curse was to blame. Historians still argue about how much these healers truly believed in their mixtures versus how much they played to villagers' expectations. Some may have known their herbs eased pain. Others leaned on ritual to mask uncertainty. Either way, the blend of medicine and magic gave people a sense of control in a world that rarely offered any. Your candle wax drips onto the dirt floor. The healer turns, adds a pinch of salt to the pot. Salt wasn't just flavorant, was sacred, protective. That layering of meanings gave every sip symbolic weight. You imagine villagers gagging down salty, bitter concoctions with grim determination. Little crosses carved from wood, bits of iron, even teeth. The brew wasn't just ingested, it was surrounded by protection. Drink and talisman together created a two-pronged defense, a medieval version of mixing antibiotics with a security system. You step back outside, the night air cooler after the smoky hut. The village buzzes, faintly more fires, more cauldrons, more murmured prayers. It feels like a festival, except it's desperation that unites them. You imagine entire communities brewing together during outbreaks, the air thick with herbs. The hope of healing rising with the steam, your stomach twists with memory. Back in the plague village, people strapped chickens to sores. Here, at least, there's more sense. Willow bark for pain, the ancestor of aspirin. Garlic for infections. Honey for wounds. Modern science eventually validated some of these, but for medieval people, validation wasn't the point. If the healer said this brew worked, then you swallowed it, gagged, and whispered thanks. The candle flickers, catching the glint of jars on shelves. You spot one filled with dark liquid, thicker than broth. Some brews weren't meant to heal, they were meant to ward. Drink this before travel, and you'd be safe from curses. Medicine and magic blurred until every gulp was both cure and prayer. Historians still argue whether the church supported or condemned such practices. Some priests tolerated healers as long as they invoked saints. Others condemned them as witches, too close to sorcery. The line was razor thin. Tonight's helpful potion could be tomorrow's evidence of heresy. Yet people kept brewing because life demanded it. The quirky tidbit deepens. Not all brews were swallowed. Some were poured across thresholds, smeared on doorframes, or tossed into wells to purify. Imagine a family solemnly pouring bitter tea on the floor and nodding, yes, that should keep the devil out. Half cleaning, half exorcism. The air grows thick with steam as more huts vent their remedies. A village brewing together wasn't just treating illness, it was treating fear. The act itself, the smells, the rituals, built a sense of community resilience, everyone chuckling, despite the worry. Humor, after all, was its own medicine, you mutter to yourself. Sarcasm slipping in. Medieval pharmacy, now open with 3-for-1 deals on nettle soup, frog dust, and prayers. The joke steadies you, but it also underlines the truth. Medicine wasn't about neat labels. It was about mixing everything you had into one desperate concoction. You step farther from the village, the smell fading behind. The road feels lonelier, but your pockets smell faintly of herbs now, as though the magic clung to you. And you realize superstition wasn't stupidity. It was survival with the tools available. Your candle burns low again, wax almost gone. You sigh, whispering one last half-joke. If medieval Yelp existed, healers would all have 5 stars for effort, 1 star for taste. You grin, but it's soft, almost fond. Because somewhere in that bitter mix of herbs and hopes, the medieval world found a way to keep walking forward. The scent of herbs fades as you leave the village behind, but the night refuses to grow quiet. Instead, it hums with a strange expectancy, as if the trees themselves lean closer to listen. You've heard whispers about these woods, their beauty, yes, but also their danger. Not the danger of wolves or bandits, though those are real enough, but of something slipperier, more whimsical, and far less predictable. You take a cautious step onto the forest path and remember what every medieval villager muttered. When shadows thickened, beware the fear of fairies. Unlike the witches or demons, the church thundered against fairies, occupied a peculiar space. They weren't always evil. Sometimes they blessed crops, left gifts, or even helped with chores. But they were capricious, their moods as changeable as the wind. To the medieval imagination, fairies weren't Disney's sparkling companions. They were unpredictable neighbors, sometimes charming, sometimes cruel, always demanding respect. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval texts, like the romance of Sir Orpheus and scattered folk tales, recorded encounters with fairy folk, often portraying them as a parallel society, beautiful, immortal, but perilously detached from human morality. Historians still argue whether fairies were treated as literal beings or as symbolic stand-ins for natural forces and pagan spirits. But in villages across Europe, people left offerings at fairy sites, as if the beings were absolutely real. You pause by an oak tree, its roots gnarled like sleeping animals. At its base lies a small bowl of milk, fresh, glistening in the moonlight. Someone left it there tonight, an offering. Villagers believed gifts of milk, bread, or honey might placate the fair folk, ensuring they passed by without mischief. Forget to leave the offering, and your cow might dry up, your child might sicken, or your shoes might vanish overnight. The quirky tidbit: people sometimes baked special loaves called fairy bread, small round cakes sprinkled with salt, which was thought to both please and restrain the fair folk. Imagine kneeling at midnight to scatter salt on a muffin, while muttering, "Please don't steal my baby." Odd, yes, but in a world where unseen forces seemed everywhere, it was a logical insurance policy. You keep walking, and the forest deepens. Branches twist overhead, blotting out even the moon. The candle flame in your hand feels meager against the looming dark. Somewhere, a twig snaps. You freeze. Was it a fox, or was it one of them? Fairies, people believed, could shrink or grow at will, slipping through keyholes or towering over treetops. Their laughter might sound like children playing or like bells tinkling in the wind, and if you heard it at night, you didn't follow. Everyone knew better than to chase fairy laughter into the trees. Still, temptation was part of their danger. Stories told of travelers lured by music haunting, irresistible tunes that pulled you off the road and into circles of light. Inside those circles, time bent. You might dance for what feels like an hour, only to stumble back into the village 100 years later, everyone you loved gone. Historians still argue whether such tales were allegories for the dangers of wandering or whether they reflected genuine belief in time slips. Either way, the fairy ring of mushrooms at your feet suddenly looks less like fungus and more like a trapdoor. You step carefully around it, whispering a nervous joke. Note to self-avoid medieval raves in the forest. The chuckle steadies you, but your heart still hammers. Fairies weren't always anonymous either. Villagers gave them names: the good neighbors, the hidden people, the kindly ones. Politeness mattered. Call them directly fairies, and you risked offense. Better to flatter, to hint, to treat them as honored guests. After all, nobody wanted to provoke creatures who could blight crops with a glance or sour milk with a sigh. The quirky detail deepens. Iron was thought to repel fairies. Villagers tucked iron nails into cradles or war pins on clothing to keep the creatures away. Babies, especially, were vulnerable. Changeling tales abounded, stories of fairies stealing human infants and leaving behind sickly, strange-looking replacements. If your child cried too much, looked oddly pale, or failed to grow, neighbors might whisper, "That's no human child." The terror of losing a child mixed with the terror of misunderstanding, illness, and suddenly the woods seemed full of kidnappers, invisible to the eye. You hear a rustle again, closer this time, and lift your candle. Just a rabbit. You laugh, but it's uneasy. Imagine being a medieval parent, walking home late with a baby, clutching iron scissors in one hand and whispering prayers. Every rustle might feel like a fairy waiting to snatch what you loved most. Historians still argue whether fairy lore was tolerated by the church or condemned as pagan. Evidence suggests a mix. Some priests thundered against it. Others quietly allowed offerings at fairy hills, perhaps recognizing that fear was too deeply rooted to erase. After all, it's hard to tell villagers not to fear the very forest they walked daily. You pause at a small brook. The water glimmers silver, and on the bank sits a stone covered in moss. Villagers often believed brooks and hills were fairy gateways. Toss a coin into the water, and you might earn safe passage. Insult it, and you risked being dragged under. You crouch, considering whether to leave a coin. Then you laugh, softly. "I'd rather not be today's missing villager." Headline. You flick a pebble instead, watching the ripples spread. Insurance, however cheap. The forest clears slightly, and you notice another offering site, a small hollow tree stuffed with scraps of cloth, ribbons, and trinkets. This is a clootie tree, still found in parts of Europe today. People tied rags, soaked with illness or sorrow, hoping the fairies or the spirits of the place would take them away. Each rag was a bargain, a plea for healing. The sight of dozens fluttering in the moonlight must have been haunting, like a ghostly wardrobe of other people's fears. You sigh, candle flame shrinking. The path ahead feels endless, but you understand why fairies lingered so strongly in the medieval mind. They explained the inexplicable lost children, sudden misfortune, wild joy, unearthly music. They gave shape to the feeling that the world was more alive than it appeared. Dangerous, yes, but alive. You whisper another joke, softer this time. Imagine explaining to a medieval villager that fairies became cute Christmas ornaments. They'd probably faint from insult. You grin, though the humor is tinged with sadness. Because, for them, fairies weren't decorations. They were neighbors, unpredictable and real, shaping the way you stepped through the dark dot. The night feels a little lighter, though the trees at your back seem to whisper. You know the villagers will continue leaving milk at roots, tying cloth to branches, and whispering polite nicknames. Because whether fairies were real or not, the fear was. And in the medieval world, fear was enough to make the unseen walk beside you. The storm drifts behind you, leaving the world damp and hushed. Raindrops cling to hedges and glisten faintly in the starlight, each bead a tiny mirror. You trudge along the sodden road, boots heavy with mud, until you notice yourself counting. Steps 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you stop abruptly, your throat tightening. In the medieval mind, numbers weren't just math. They carried weight, luck, danger, and sacredness. Tonight, every step feels like an incantation. You've wandered into the world of numbers that haunt. Numbers shaped medieval life far beyond tallying sheep or coins. 3, for instance, was sacred, the Trinity, balance, perfection. To do something 3 times was to seal it. 3 prayers, 3 knocks on wood, 3 kisses of the cross. But the wrong number carried equal dread. 13, especially, was unlucky, linked to Judas at the Last Supper. To sit 13 at a table was to invite death before the year was done. You glance nervously at the path and mutter, better not. Count 13 puddles. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval builders infused numbers into architecture. Cathedrals were designed with precise measurements, symbolizing biblical truths. 7 for creation, 12 for apostles, 44 days of trial. Walking through those soaring halls, villagers weren't just in stone buildings. They were inside a giant numerical prayer. Historians still argue how much the common peasant grasped these hidden meanings, versus how much was understood only by clerics and masons. But one thing is clear. Numbers mattered, whether carved into stone or whispered on lips. You step carefully, resuming your count, but stop again at 7. That number soothed medieval minds. 7 days of creation, 7 virtues, 7 sacraments. It promised completeness. No wonder people leaned on it. A child born on the 7th day of the month was considered blessed. A prayer repeated 7 times was thought to carry special weight. Even herbs picked on the 7th day of the 7th month held extra potency. You grin weakly, whispering, "Lucky me, stepping in my 7th mud puddle tonight. Definitely blessed." The quirky tidbit. Some villagers swore that if you sneezed 7 times in a row, it meant marriage was coming. Others said it foretold death. The contradiction didn't bother them. Numbers weren't about logic, they were about possibility. You picture a poor farmer sneezing while his neighbors debate whether to plan a wedding feast or a funeral. The road narrows between hedgerows, and you notice crude carvings etched into the wood: X marks, circles, tallies. Villagers often marked doors with numbers to ward off evil, for in some places symbolized stability for gospels, for seasons, for corners of the earth. But in others, it carried ill fortune. Numbers weren't universal. They shifted by region, each village writing its own code. Historians still argue whether these variations were remnants of pagan numerology or simply local tradition. Your candle gutters in the damp breeze, and you mutter a short sequence under your breath, almost without thinking. 1 for luck, 2 for love, 3 for protection. Nursery rhymes and counting charms often blended into everyday superstition. Children learned them young, turning play into ritual. A game of hopscotch might double as a charm, the numbers grounding you in a world too unpredictable. You remember a story told in taverns. A gambler who rolled dice and struck sixes thrice was believed blessed by fate or cursed, depending on the outcome. Dice themselves carried suspicion. Too much luck, and villagers muttered about demons guiding your hand. Too much loss, and you cursed the numbers etched into bones. Numbers became personalities: friendly, sly, vengeful. Another quirky detail: villagers sometimes used magic squares, grids of numbers adding up the same across rows and columns, as protective talismans. They'd carve them onto amulets or doorframes, convinced the mathematical harmony would repel chaos. Imagine scratching equations into your barn wall as your medieval version of antivirus software. The stars above shimmer faintly, and you think about how numbers govern the heavens too. Astrologers charted planets in 12s, zodiac signs, houses, divisions of fate. To miss a number in your birth chart was to misunderstand destiny itself. Villagers might not know the technicalities, but they absorbed the sense that numbers weren't arbitrary. They were keys to the universe, tiny codes written into everything. Historians still argue whether peasants actually feared unlucky numbers daily, or whether these concerns flared mostly during rituals, weddings, births, feasts. But stories suggest the fear seeped into ordinary life. A baker might refuse to sell 13 loaves. Hence, the baker's dozen tradition of giving 14 instead. Not generosity and assurance. You smirk and whisper, "Next time I buy bread, I'll demand the anti-cur's loaf." You stumble on a stone, catching yourself, and notice faint marks carved into it. Your chest tightens. Even now, the number feels heavy, though you know it's just stone. That's the power of superstition. Knowledge doesn't always silence instinct. Another quirky tidbit: in some villages, people avoided counting children out loud. To say "I have 3 sons" might invite fate to reduce the number. Better to say "I have sons enough" and leave it vague. Numbers spoken too plainly tempted envy, curses, or mischief from the unseen. You glance back at the path, wondering if your own step counting has drawn unwanted ears. The candle flickers again, nearly dying. You press forward, whispering softly, not quite prayer, not quite charm. 1, to keep walking. 2, to stay safe. 3, to reach morning. The rhythm comforts you like a heartbeat. That was the medieval way numbers, as lullabies against fear. Historians still argue how much of numerology was official theology versus folk invention. The church embraced symbolic numbers 3, 7, 12, but peasants spun their own, weaving local fears into the fabric. The result was a patchwork, sacred math stitched into superstition. You walk inside that patchwork tonight, every step tugging another thread. Ahead, the road opens onto a chapel ruin. Its arch still stands, and carved into the stone are rows of numbers, Roman numerals, once marking liturgical calendars. Rain has blurred them, but you trace them with your finger, feeling centuries of faith etched into stone. Numbers weren't just abstract, they were architecture, scripture, and protection. You sigh, realizing you've been counting again. Old habits cling. 1, 2, 3, always 3. You laugh, softly, whispering, "If the spirits are listening, I hope they like my math homework." The joke lightens your chest, though unease lingers, because in the medieval world, numbers weren't innocent. They haunted, blessed, condemned. They dictated when you sowed fields, when you married, even when you buried the dead. To step wrong in numbers was to step wrong in fate. Your candle finally dies, smoke curling upward. The moon gives just enough light, but you don't count your steps anymore, not tonight. Some numbers are better left unspoken in the dark. The night has grown quieter now, the storm long gone, and the numbers fading from your lips. But the silence doesn't comfort you. Instead, it presses against your ears, like heavy wool, too thick to complete. Ahead, the road curves past a low stone wall, and beyond it, rows of crooked slabs lean against the horizon. You realize you've stumbled into a graveyard. Your chest tightens, because in the medieval world, this wasn't just a place of rest. It was a place of fear, a space where the restless dead might rise. The graves glisten faintly with rain. Moss curls over the edges of the stones, and the earth seems freshly disturbed in places. You swallow hard, candle trembling, because villagers whispered often about corpses refusing to stay put. Not as elegant ghosts drifting politely through halls, but as flesh and bone bodies clawing out of the soil, driven by sin, curses, or unfinished business. These were revenants, the restless dead, and to medieval minds they were terrifyingly real. Mainstream historical fact. Chroniclers in the 12th century, like William of Newburgh, recorded stories of revenants in England. He wrote of corpses rising to terrorize villages, spreading disease, or even physically attacking the living. These weren't abstract spirits. They were described in unsettling detail, bloated, stinking, with eyes gleaming red in the dark. Historians still argue whether these accounts were metaphors for plague and guilt, or whether villagers truly believed in walking corpses. But the consistency of the stories across Europe suggests belief was widespread. You step carefully between the stones, boots squelching in wet grass. Somewhere in the dark, an owl hoots, and you nearly drop your candle. You imagine peasants huddled in cottages, whispering about how to deal with a restless corpse. Dig it up and stake it through the chest, burn it to ash. Or, in some cases, simply place heavy stones over the grave so it couldn't crawl free. Archaeologists have found skeletons pinned with rocks in their mouths or pressed under boulders, evidence that superstition left very physical marks. The quirky tidbit: in some villages, they buried suspected revenants face down, so if the corpse tried to dig out, it would only claw deeper into the soil. You grin nervously, whispering, medieval failsafes. Bury your problems upside down. Humor helps, but your candlelight dances across too many stones for comfort. You pause at a grave marked with a crude wooden cross. Rain has warped the wood, making it lean. You picture villagers crowding here after a sudden death, muttering prayers, each secretly hoping the soul stays put. Funerals weren't just grief, they were safeguards, ceremonies designed to keep the dead where they belonged. Without proper rites, the risk of haunting grew. A corpse left unblessed might wander the lanes by night, knocking on doors. And if it knocked on yours, well, that meant someone inside would die soon. Historians still argue whether these beliefs reflect pagan echoes or pure Christian fear. The Church certainly condemned revenant tales, yet priests sometimes performed rituals, burnings, reburials that suggest even they weren't immune to local panic. Imagine a priest lecturing against superstition by day, then secretly staking a corpse by night just in case. Faith and fear often shared the same bed. You step deeper among the graves, the ground squelches, and you recall another quirky belief. The first person buried in a churchyard became the graveyard's guardian. Their spirit lingered, keeping the others quiet. If no one wanted that role, a dog or animal might be buried first, instead sacrificed as a watchman. You picture some poor hound sleeping eternally under these stones, ears pricked for undead stirrings. Your candle sputters, almost gone, and you quicken your steps. The moonlight throws strange shadow stones, leaning like crooked teeth, trees clawing the sky. You remember how villagers often avoided graveyards at night, unless absolutely necessary. Spirits, they said, were most active after midnight. Some wandered to settle grudges, others simply roamed because their souls couldn't find rest. To encounter one was to risk sickness or death. Better to stay home, bar the door, and pray. Yet, despite the fear, graveyards were part of daily life. Children played near them, villagers grazed animals close by, lovers even met in their shadows. Death wasn't distant, it was woven into existence. Perhaps that's why the restless dead haunted so vividly, because everyone lived so near the line. It was easy to imagine someone stepping back across it. A sudden gust rustles the grass, and you almost swear you see movement near a mound. Your heart lurches, and you remind yourself it's only wind. Still, you whisper sarcastically, "If anyone's climbing out, please wait until I'm gone. Much appreciated." Humor steadies your shaking hands, but you don't slow down. Historians still argue about whether tales of revenants inspired later vampire legends. Many early accounts describe bloated corpses spreading disease, eerily similar to later vampire myths. In some regions, suspected revenants were dug up and their hearts removed, or burned. Rituals echoed in later vampire hunts. The line between folklore and lived practice blurs. Two villagers, both were real threats. You pass a grave with stones piled high upon it. Someone wanted to be sure. You wonder who they were, what they did to earn suspicion. Maybe they were a sinner. Maybe they were just unlucky. The tragedy of superstition is clear here. Fear didn't stop at death. It followed you into the grave. The quirky tidbit deepens. Some communities rang church bells, not just for the living, but to soothe the dead, keeping them calm beneath the earth. Nighttime tolls echoed across valleys, comfort for villagers Warning: for spirits. You picture lying awake in a cottage, listening to distant bells and whispering, "Stay down, stay asleep." The candle finally dies, smoke curling upward. You stand in the graveyard with only the moon for light. For a heartbeat, panic claws at your throat. Then you breathe, slow and steady, telling yourself the graves are quiet tonight. But the unease lingers, because whether or not revenants ever rose, the belief itself had power. Villagers walked differently in graveyards, whispered differently, lived differently, because they knew the line between life and death was fragile, and sometimes disturbingly porous. You step carefully out of the graveyard, back onto the road, heart still pounding. You mutter one last joke, voice soft in the night. Note to self: if I die here, please bury me with extra rocks, and maybe upside down, just to be sure. The sarcasm fades into a shaky laugh, but you don't stop walking until the crooked stones vanish behind you, because the medieval world didn't let you forget. The dead weren't always gone. Sometimes they walked with you. The road winds away from the graveyard, but your shoulders stay tense. You keep glancing over your shoulder, half expecting one of those restless villagers to stumble after you. The moon glints off puddles in the ruts, and your boots splash softly. You think you're safe until the sound of voices drifts through the night. Low, nervous murmurs, gathering near the edge of a stream. You creep closer, and the glow of torches reveals a grim scene. Villagers stand in a circle, faces pale, eyes wide. At the center, a trembling young woman clutches her shawl, while two men hold her arms. Someone whispers about witchcraft. You've stumbled into a trial by fire and water. In the medieval imagination, justice didn't always come from courts or logic. Sometimes it came from ordeal tests, designed not to uncover evidence, but to let the divine decide. If God protected you, you were innocent. If not, well, the river or the flames would have their say. Tonight, superstition has taken the shape of judgment. Mainstream historical fact. Ordeals were widespread in medieval Europe until the 13th century, when the Church officially condemned them. Still, traces lingered in folk practice for centuries. The ordeals included fire, water, and even combat. A suspected criminal might carry a red-hot iron or plunge their arm into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly, they were declared innocent. Others were bound and thrown into rivers. If they floated, guilt was proven because water, pure and holy, rejected them. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed these methods revealed divine will, or whether the spectacle itself served as social control. You watch as the men drag the woman toward the stream. Her hair clings damply to her cheeks, her knees buckle, and she begs for mercy. The villagers murmur, some sympathetic, some eager, all anxious. Fear hangs heavy, thicker than the mist. This isn't just about her. It's about everyone watching, about proving that justice exists in a world too often ruled by chaos. A quirky tidbit: sometimes ordeals were preceded by fasting and prayer, as though preparing the accused and the community for divine revelation. Imagine starving for 3 days only to be dunked into a freezing river while your neighbors argued over your buoyancy. Medieval spa day, this was not. The woman is bound with rope, hands tied tightly, and for a moment you can't breathe. You know the logic. If she sinks, she's innocent, but likely dead. If she floats, she's guilty and doomed anyway. It's a lose-lose, but in the villagers' eyes, it's proof. They don't need evidence. They need certainty. She's lowered into the water, and the crowd leans forward. You clutch your cloak tighter, heart hammering. She thrashes, sinks briefly, then bobs upward, sputtering. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Some nod grimly, guilty. Others whisper uneasily, not quite convinced. You realize superstition wasn't always unanimous. Doubt existed, but doubt was dangerous. To question the ordeal was to question the system that kept fear at bay. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were rigged. Did villagers quietly ensure some sank or floated as expected? Was divine judgment sometimes just clever stage management? Evidence suggests communities sometimes manipulated outcomes to avoid killing people they liked her, to ensure those they hated didn't survive. Either way, the belief that God's hand was present gave everyone permission to accept the result. You edge closer, candles sputtering in the damp air, and catch sight of another man holding a brand from the fire. His task is simpler but crueler. Carrying the hot iron. Another common ordeal demanded suspects walk a few steps, holding glowing metal. If their hand healed cleanly in 3 days, innocence was proven. If it festered, guilt, of course, burns. Usually fester. But in a world hungry for signs, even pus became prophecy. The quirky tidbit deepens. In some villages, ordeals weren't just for witches or criminals. They were used for petty disputes, arguments over land boundaries, quarrels between neighbors. Imagine suing your neighbor for stealing chickens, only to settle it by dunking yourself in the river. Legal drama, medieval style. The woman in the water is pulled out, coughing, shivering. Her face is pale, her lips blue, but her fate is sealed. The villagers murmur, some relieved, others uneasy. You realize that ordeals weren't just about punishment, they were theater. Everyone left with a story. Justice had been done, God had spoken, order was restored. It didn't matter if the outcome was cruel. What mattered was that uncertainty had been crushed beneath ritual. You take a shaky breath, watching the firelight flicker on their faces. The ordeal is over, but the fear lingers. Each villager walks away reminded that they, too, could stand at the center one day. That paranoia kept communities in line. Don't anger your neighbors. Don't stand out. Don't whisper too loudly in the night. Because if suspicion fell on you, the river might be waiting. Historians still argue whether villagers believed ordeals worked, or whether they simply tolerated them as necessary rituals. Perhaps belief wasn't even the point. Perhaps the ordeal was about making fear visible, channeling it into spectacle. When you see someone bound, burned, or drowned, you remember the consequences of chaos. You behave, you comply, you step back into the shadows, unwilling to be seen. The villagers drift away, torches bobbing into the dark, their whispers fading. The stream runs quietly again, as if nothing happened, but the image stays with you. The shivering woman, the red-hot brand, the crowd's hungry eyes. Justice, twisted through superstition, had been fed for another night. You mutter a shaky joke to yourself. Medieval courtroom drama, judge, jury, and river. The humor is thin, but it's all you have. Because deep down, you understand how terrifying it must have been to live under such a system. Not just fearing demons or storms, but fearing your own community, your own reflection in the torchlight, waiting for the night when fingers pointed your way. The stream gurgles softly. As you walk on, candle nearly gone. You leave the ordeal behind, but its lesson clings. In the medieval world, superstition didn't just haunt dreams or plague nights. It ruled justice, decided guilt, and shaped how neighbors looked at each other. And if you were unlucky enough to stand at the center, the only defense you had was prey on, maybe the faint hope that water or fire would show you mercy. The night is nearly spent. The moon hangs lower now, pale and worn, as though it too is weary of watching. Your boots scuff along the path, heavy with mud and memory. You've seen superstition in alleyways, crossroads, plague fires, and ruined castles. Yet the darkest part of the medieval imagination is still ahead, because when the bells fell silent and the cock crowed late, villagers whispered about the most dangerous time of all. Whispers at midnight. You slow your steps, because midnight isn't just a number. It's the threshold, the moment when one day dies and another is born. Historians still argue whether medieval people tracked time with precision enough to mark the exact hour. But in their minds, midnight was less a clock hand and more a presence. The dead stirred then, demons prowled, and prayers doubled in urgency. If you found yourself awake at that hour, you weren't just sleepless, you were exposed. Mainstream historical fact: monks rose at midnight for the office of matins, prayers meant to battle darkness with chant. The belief was clear: if holy voices didn't rise, then unholy ones would. For peasants, though, midnight wasn't a time for singing. It was the hour of whispers, when the unseen slipped closest to the hearth. Villagers stayed quiet, doors barred, voices hushed. To speak too loudly was to invite someone or something to answer. You reach a fork in the road and pause. The hedges seem taller, the shadows deeper. You hear nothing but your own breath, yet the silence feels filled, as though invisible figures lean close to listen. That's why people spoke in whispers, not because they wanted to, but because they feared who else might overhear. A cough in the rafters, a creak on the floorboards, perhaps not the wind at all, but something waiting for your voice to guide it. A quirky tidbit: in some villages, people swore you must never call someone's name aloud at midnight. If they were asleep, the spirits might steal their soul in response. Imagine shaking your husband awake, only to realize you've just delivered him into a ghost's hands. So instead, people tapped shoulders or muttered vague noises. Midnight etiquette: don't say names, don't say much at all. The candle in your hand is nearly gone, its stub quivering against the damp air. You cup it in your palm, but the flame still leans, desperate. You remember another belief: if a candle burned out exactly at midnight, it meant a death in the house. The flame itself was seen as a mirror of life. So you hunch lower, guarding yours, whispering half-jokingly, "Stay alive, little wax friend, or I'm doomed." You step into a clearing, where the road skirts a churchyard. Bells hang silent in the tower, but you imagine them tolling. Villagers once rang bells at midnight to scatter spirits, their sound cutting through whispers. Without them, you feel exposed. The graves beyond the wall seem to lean closer, their stones pale in the moonlight. You quicken your steps. Historians still argue whether midnight held special weight across Europe or whether local traditions exaggerated its danger. Some chronicles suggest villagers saw the whole span between dusk and dawn as threatening. Others specifically called midnight the dead hour, when supernatural forces were strongest. Either way, the lesson was the same. Don't wander then, don't linger, don't tempt the whispers. And yet, some did. Night workers, travelers, lovers, sneaking out, all risked exposure. They armed themselves with charms, iron nails, holy water, muttered prayers. Some carried black-handled knives, thought to slice through enchantments. Others wore sprigs of rue or garlic. Each talisman said the same thing: I know midnight listens, but I'm not afraid, except, of course, they were. You hear a sound soft, low, like two voices murmuring just beyond the hedge. You freeze, breath held. It's not words you recognize, just a cadence, a rhythm. You strain your ears, but as soon as you focus, the whispers stop. You stand there, heart hammering, and remember countless tales of villagers hearing voices at midnight. Sometimes they were omens, warning of death. Sometimes they were tricks, luring wanderers into the dark. Always they left listeners rattled. A quirky detail: some peasants believed animals could speak at midnight on Christmas Eve. Oxen, sheep, even dogs were said to mutter words. Children dared each other to creep into barns to hear it. But the catch: if you actually understood what the animals said, you'd die within the year. Imagine crouching by your cow, hearing it mutter, "Cold tonight," and immediately panicking about your will. You chuckle nervously, whispering, note to self-ignore, chatty cows. Humor steadies you, but the chill lingers. Midnight was playful, yes, but also perilous. The candle's flame sputters, threatening extinction. You shake it gently, muttering prayers. Villagers often left candles burning all night, precisely to keep spirits at bay. Extinguish them, and shadows thickened. Whispers crept closer. Fire was more than light. It was a guardian. Your stub survives. A little longer, though wax dribbles hot onto your knuckles. Historians still argue whether midnight superstitions functioned more as curfews than cosmic truths. Perhaps whispers of demons were convenient ways to keep people inside, safe from wolves or bandits. But whether practical or spiritual, the fear was real. People believed the hour itself could harm. You step onto a bridge, the river below black and swollen. Water at midnight was doubly feared. Spirits were said to gather there, whispering beneath the current. Some villagers threw crumbs or coins into rivers at midnight to appease the unseen. Others simply avoided bridges after dark, unwilling to risk hearing voices from the depths. You pause, listening, and swear you catch faint murmurs rising with the splash. You walk faster. The quirky tidbit deepens in some regions. Villagers left bread and butter out on the table at midnight so household spirits could feed, and the whispers turned angry, spoiling milk or souring beer. Midnight wasn't just outside, it seeped into kitchens, bedrooms, every corner of life. The whispers lived where you did. You climb the far bank, exhausted now, and the first gray hint of dawn tugs at the horizon. The whispers fade with it. The birds haven't started yet, but the air feels thinner, safer, less crowded. You sigh, shoulders loosening for the first time in hours. Midnight has passed. The worst has ebbed. You stop by a tree and sink to the Damp grass. Your candle burns its last, curling into smoke. You close your eyes and think of everything you've seen tonight. Candles against darkness. Charms in pockets, witches accused, relics venerated, numbers counted, storms survived, fairies placated, graves avoided. Each superstition was absurd, yes, but also practical. Each one a fragile wall built against fear. And now, as dawn presses closer, you let your voice drop softer, slower. The medieval night is long, but it always ends. Roosters will crow, bells will ring, and life will stumble back into its noisy, messy rhythm. For now, though, the air is quiet, the whispers fade, the stars grow faint. You breathe deeply, letting the calm seep in, letting your heart beat slow. It's time to let go of the night, time to let the stories settle, time to drift, not into dread, but into rest. The road unwinds, the sky lightens, and the candles' smoke curls like a lullaby. You've walked through shadows, superstition, and fear, and you've reached the edge of morning. Close your eyes now, feel the air soften, hear the faint hum of life returning, and let the last of the fear dissolve. The medieval world had its darkness, its terrors, but even then, dawn always came. And so it comes for you, too.